What if the only person who can save your life's work today is the person you pass every morning without ever learning their name? At 7:42 a.m., the Aurelius Grand was the kind of beautiful that made strangers lower their voices. River light spilled through the east-facing glass and slid across a marble like a blessing, catching on crystal chandeliers that had been dusted within an inch of their atoms. The cafe hissed inside, extruding cappuccino foam into tulips on porcelain. A bellman in dove gray moved a luggage cart that gleamed like a promise. For the well-dressed, it was a Thursday. For Adrian Vale, it was a countdown. He placed his second espresso on a leather blotter and watched the surface jump when the front desk supervisor skidded through his office door with a notepad clamped in both hands. Her breath came in the quick, embarrassed gulps of someone who has run through spaces where she is supposed to glide. "Mr. Vale," she said, voice catching. "He's coming, at noon." Adrian's first reaction was the practiced half-smile of a man who had learned never to flinch in front of staff. His second reaction was private and physical, a tightness behind the ribs, a quick contraction of the throat, as if the air had been seasoned without warning. "Who," he asked, "is he?" "Liang Zhenyu," she said. "The West Coast tour. The property magnate. We just received confirmation from his assistant. He wants to see the presidential suite, the ballroom, the kitchen, and," she swallowed, "staff facilities. He values discretion. He will be here at 12. Noon meant 4 hours. Less, really. Adrian's mind measured time not in minutes, but in tasks stacked in parallel. He saw the list bloom. Floors buffed again, vents dusted, drapes steamed, place settings aligned to the millimeter, a tea set laid carefully in the suite with a note that looked like hand, not printer. Security to be visible to those who needed safety and invisible to those who paid to forget danger existed. He could order all of that into place with 10 sentences and a look. He could not order Mandarin. "Interpreter?" he asked. "None confirmed," she said. "2 agencies can send at 3. 3 was a lifetime beyond noon. Adrian released the espresso, which clinked against the saucer like small thunder, and stood. His chair rolled back without a squeak because he paid people to oil the things that other hotels let squeak. He stepped to the mezzanine rail above the lobby and spoke 3 sentences into the cool, curated air. Departments materialized as if out of a magic trick they had rehearsed with him for years. He did not bark. He calibrated. "Ballroom polish and layout pass in 20, he said. "Suite inspection in 30. Kitchen, tasting tray, and tea. Valet, alignment drill and timing on porte cochere pulls. Security, heightened presence, melt posture. Maintenance unfurled ladders like quiet circus apparatus and sent a man in a harness on a pilgrimage toward a chandelier. Arm no guest could name, but every guest would feel. Housekeeping split into squads that moved with a tactical grace, small bottles of metal polish appearing in palms as if conjured. The florist arrived with orchids that looked like white birds mid-flight, and lilies that, if you were superstitious, foretold good money. Adrian descended the grand stairs with his hands behind his back the way CEOs walk when they are performing steadiness for the people whose livelihoods depend on their steadiness. He looked the way the hotel wanted to be looked at. Midnight blue suit that didn't quite shine, a wave of hair that held its place against the day, shoes that turned marble into metronome. He touched everything with his eyes. The framed photo of a ribbon cutting that had gone on a little too long, the brass rail along the staircase that made a wide S and took fingerprints like a sinful friend. A scuff on the Nero Marquina at the base of a column that would mean nothing to a billionaire and everything to Adrian if he noticed it first. He could fix scuffs. He could not fix tones. The word Mandarin sat in his mouth like an unfamiliar stone. He had meant to start last quarter. He had saved articles about the 4 tones, then 5 if you counted neutral, about the way meaning rode them like a bird rides wind. He had skimmed stories about missteps, ma, 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 and laughed the way you laugh when you think you have years to learn. The Aurelius had prepped successfully for Americans and French and Italians, and even a Saudi who flattered their lobby's taste and then failed to arrive. He had allies for those languages. He had scripts. He had none for today. He crossed the lobby, admiration and impatience braided into a single rope in his chest. He watched a trainee bellman adjust his tie in the reflection on an elevator door, saw the boy's hand tremble just a fraction, and added a note to say something kind later. He moved toward the ballroom and passed, without registering, a woman polishing the rail with a patience that made metal remember what it wanted to be. She wore black and white like every other housekeeper in the building, hair pulled back neatly, posture a little softer than military, but harder than casual. The brass in front of her caught the light and threw it back like a new word. He did not know her name. He knew orchids by cultivar and chandeliers by supplier and investors by middle initial. He knew where donors had stood when they had their photo taken beside a novelty check. He knew the language of budgets and the dialect of investor panic. He did not know the person who had polished those rails every morning long before he arrived. Her name was Naomi Carter. She lived across the river in West Sacramento with her 17-year-old son, Malik, who had a defensive back shoulders and a poet's eyes, and a part-time job at a grocery store where he carried water for grandmothers and never let the eggs sit beside the cleaning products. Naomi's morning began at 5:15 with coffee and the quiet pleasure of a kitchen that belonged to her. She did not resent work. She resented that people assumed work explained the size of her life. Long before she wiped brass in a hotel that traded on light, she had sat in a community college classroom in San Francisco and fallen in love with the way Mandarin moved in the mouth. At first, it was a thing she did to help international students with English homework. In exchange, they taught her tones, drew characters on the backs of napkins, told stories about grandmothers who pinched arms and fed and forgave. She had kept going, class after class, then tutoring children of new arrivals, then volunteering at a cultural center on Saturdays because language she learned isn't just words, it's a way to arrange attention. She did not put Mandarin on her HR profile. Nobody had asked. When you have worked in hotels long enough, you learn a taxonomy of who gets asked. At 9:15, the rumor completed a loop through the building's veins. Billionaire, Mandarin, noon. Even the river outside the glass looked like it tilted its ear. The pastry chef piped cream into eclairs with a focus that resembled prayer. Valet attendants practiced synchronized door pulls until the motion felt like one idea performed by 6 bodies. Events ironed a wrinkle out of a drape no camera would ever notice and felt, for a moment, like heroes. The building's heart rate increased without appearing to. At 9:27, an email arrived from Unwei, assistant to Mr. Liang. The lines were carved with respect and clarity. Arrival, 12 p.m. Requests, presidential suite, ballroom, kitchen, staff facilities. Values, punctuality, sincerity, sincerity. The word irritated and intrigued Adrian in equal measure. He trusted Polish. He sold polish. He believed in sincerity, but not as a lever you could pull on demand. The hotel either had it or it didn't. He read the line again and felt, for the first time that morning, something like homesickness for a quality he had been too busy to practice. He prowled the suite. He tugged a drape. He moved a pillow and watched a housekeeper make the bed breathe again with 3 gestures that looked like sleight of hand. He complimented, corrected, thanked. He requested a tray with cups so thin you could see light through them, a small jar of Longjing leaves, and a handwritten note that said welcome in ink that hinted at a hand, not a brand. He had never drank Longjing. He had watched a video about water temperature and pretended that was respect. Janine from operations caught up to him in the hallway. "We could let Mr. Liang bring an interpreter," she said. "You focus on the building." Adrian's mouth set a fraction. "We're not a backdrop," he said. "We are the scene." Downstairs, Naomi loaded fresh towels in a linen closet and paused for a breath at the sheet of glass that framed the porte cochere. The morning had turned the river's surface into hammered silver. Angela from housekeeping bumped her cart lightly into Naomi's and leaned close, conspiratorial. "You hear?" Angela said. "He only speaks Mandarin." Naomi's mouth curved around a secret smile she had kept for years. "They say that." "You ever seen Vale like this?" Angela asked, eyes bright. "Man looks like the chandelier is personally judging him." Naomi let a soft laugh out through her nose. "He will be fine," she said. What she meant was, he will be fine if we decide to hold him up. At 11:57, the lobby drew itself into a held breath. At 12:01, the black SUV eased to a stop under the awning, and doors opened with the quiet physics of money and habit. Liang Zhenyu stepped out. He was not tall and did not need to be. He carried stillness as if it were the most expensive accessory in the room. His suit fit like a sentence without wasted words. Two assistants flowed behind him, their eyes already indexing the lobby. The angle of chairs, the temperature line on the glass, the way staff faces arrange themselves. Fear, pride, boredom, welcome. Mr. Liang glanced up once at the chandelier, the size of an orbit, and did not smile. His gaze returned to the level where people live. Adrian walked down the stairs wearing the expression he had rehearsed for years. Dignified warmth, nothing desperate, a readiness to respect that did not look like supplication. He had practiced one greeting in Mandarin, 5 times alone in his office. The syllables felt like delicate glass he did not want to drop. 欢迎光临, Liang Xiansheng. Welcome, Mr. Liang. His tones were not right. They were not wrong enough to offend. Mr. Liang inclines his head. He spoke to his assistant, a quick ribbon of Mandarin that ran water over stones Adrian could not step on. The assistant said, in English that had traveled well, Mr. Liang thanks you for the welcome. He looks forward to your tour. They began. It was choreography Adrian had performed 100 times with other men whose decisions controlled oxygen. He spoke in measured sentences about bones, the column grid, the load-bearing honesty, the way the river's light is a kind of architecture, calmer than stone. The assistant carried those sentences across to Mr. Liang with the accuracy of a courier. The rhythm, however, fell half a beat behind. Meaning arrived with a lag, like oxygen at altitude. Adrian felt the room losing music. In the ballroom, Mr. Liang walked slowly out onto the parquet and said a sentence that included the words for energy and sound and elders, and the polite term for how guests breathe together when they eat. The assistant hunted a phrase, chose average, and watched it fall. Average is not a neutral word in a room you have spent a career refusing average. Adrian kept smiling not because he was a liar, but because he understood that anger in a lobby is vandalism. Under the smile, he felt the small panic you feel when you see something beautiful slipping into the river, and you know you cannot jump in without breaking your own skull. Naomi stood at the brass rail with a folded cloth, and a certainty she almost never allowed herself to use. She heard the slip, the small betrayal that happens when a word that should have curved is pressed flat. She had promised herself not to volunteer value only when someone else was drowning. She had promised herself that if they did not see her, she would not scream to be seen. She took one breath, the kind she had practiced when Malik was small and woke with fevers that were too high to be reasonable, and all she could do to save him was not panic. Then she stepped, not forward all the way, not into the center where men in suits make a certain kind of theater, just enough to be seen by the assistants, not enough to steal. She spoke in Mandarin with the tones placed carefully, respectfully, like cups on a tray. 如果您愿意，我们可以按您宾客的习惯重新安排动线。老人家坐得稳一些，通道宽一些，舞台的位置避开水晶的回声。If you'd like, we can adjust the layout to honor how your guests are used to moving. Elders seated more securely, aisles wider, the stage positioned to keep sound from pooling under crystal. Silence in a ballroom is different from silence in a chapel. It is not sacred. It is a negotiation. The room negotiated with itself for half a breath. The assistants turned. Surprise rose, crested, became relief. Mr. Liang's face shifted by degrees. A corner of his mouth softened. His eyes brightened not with sentiment, but with recognition. He answered Naomi directly in Mandarin with a question wrapped inside a compliment. She responded with words that had taken her years to earn, simple ones. No performance, no showing off. She referenced the etiquette of seat order, the honor of pouring tea with both hands, the comfort of seeing staff meet you at the edge of your language without making you pay for it. Adrian looked at Naomi and felt, in the space of 2 heartbeats, heat and cold layered like glass. Heat because shame rises when you realize you have been walking past a talent you could have elevated for years. Cold because relief has a temperature when you are pulled back from a cliff you didn't want anyone to know you were near. From that moment, the tour was not his monologue. It became a conversation, and the room seemed to grow 2 sizes larger to accommodate the simple grace of being understood in one's own tongue. Naomi translated when translation was needed, and did not when it wasn't. She added context, not content, delivered respect, not flattery. She turned features into meaning, river view into morning ritual, kitchen capacity into grandmother's pride, staff ratios into dignity, not head count. In the suite, Mr. Liang touched the glass with his fingertips as if confirming it was the river he saw and not a rich man's idea of one. He asked a question that used the word banquet and the word memory. Naomi rendered it softly into English without flattening it. Could the kitchen prepare a traditional banquet at scale without losing the soul of the dishes? Adrian said yes in the way people say yes when they mean we will find a way or die trying. Naomi carried that promise across to Mandarin and added one honest line that made it sound like a vow, not a sales pitch. We will consult rather than guess. They returned to the lobby an hour later to a building that looked the same and did not feel the same. Mr. Liang shook Adrian's hand and then turned to Naomi and inclined his head in a way that made the air itself stand straighter. He spoke in Mandarin, 7 words, crisp and warm. Naomi turned to Adrian and gave him the English that would matter for years. He says the building is beautiful, she said, but he will remember being respected in his own language. The SUV door closed. The river went on glittering as if nothing had happened. Staff drifted back to task with that secret electrical hum that follows a close call and a small miracle. Adrian stood under the chandelier and felt his shoulders drop for the first time all morning. He crossed the lobby and said, into the wide space where hotel men say only orders and congratulations, Naomi. Her eyes widened a fraction. In 5 years, he had never used her name. You didn't just help, he said. The words came out quieter than he expected. You changed what today was allowed to be. Naomi held his gaze, steady but not defiant. People aren't invisible, she said, unless you decide they are. That afternoon, he gathered the staff in the ballroom, the very room that had almost embarrassed him and had instead taught him a word he had forgotten how to use. He did not lecture. He told a story. He said 2 sentences he had not said out loud in a decade of management. I'm sorry, he said, meaning not only today. Thank you, he said, meaning not only Naomi. That night, when the building exhaled and the river moved on with its ancient errands, Adrian sat alone at his desk with an app that could not teach him humility, but could, if he let it, teach him where to put his tongue. He practiced hello and thank you and please sit and take your time. He practiced the sentence Naomi would teach him the next day when he asked her for help, not as a performance, but as a student. When you speak, she told him, do not try to sound impressive. Try to sound careful. He wrote it down in English and in Mandarin and taped it inside his desk drawer where, on the worst days and the best, he could place his hand on the panel and feel the shape of his promise through wood. What does sincerity actually look like when the swing doors close and the chandeliers can't help you? The email had used that word with the clean certainty of a surgeon. Sincerity. All morning, Adrian had told himself he understood it. Smiles at the right moments, a handwritten note, Longjing leaves placed beside cups thin enough to pass light. But sincerity, he learned by noon 30, does not care for the front-of-house costume. It walks through the kitchen in rubber soles, squints at steam, and judges how you treat the people no guest photographs. Liang asked for the kitchen not as a spectacle, but as a heartbeat. No staging, his assistant said in English. We prefer to see as it is. Naomi stood a half step behind Adrian, present because Liang had invited her with a nod that made any organizational chart irrelevant. She tied a disposable cap over her bun with both hands and then offered one to Liang, palms open, a small ceremony of respect. He accepted with a ghost of a smile and fitted it without fuss. The assistants followed suit. Adrian felt his spine lengthen. The first test had been passed, the test of not being too proud to look a little ridiculous for the sake of someone else's standards. They entered on a burst of heat and sound, the hiss of deglazing, the percussion of knives on boards, the soft drone of the hood that kept panic from tasting like smoke. Chef Alvarez moved through his domain with the tenderness of a tyrant who loved his subjects. He wasn't theatrical. He didn't need to be. He spoke softly, and the kitchen listened loudly. Adrian introduced him, the English clipped and careful. Naomi slid the words into Mandarin, not apologizing for any of them, turning line into a word that meant flow and prep into a word that meant readiness. Alvarez gestured to a lowboy, pulling open drawers that revealed green like he had bribed spring. Sugar snap peas snapped that morning, coriander still wearing its cool. Ginger lay in knuckles, turmeric-stained gloves a holy shade. Lang leaned in with the curiosity of a man who had built his fortune by letting the world teach him. He asked a series of questions Naomi had half expected, and two she hadn't, about heat retention in banquet service, about the travel time of steam, about whether the rice would hold its dignity, while eighth auntie finished her story at table 11. Alvarez didn't smile, but the corner of his mouth twitched as if he had finally met someone who understood the math of comfort. "Would you taste?" he asked. It was not bravado. It was hospitality stripped of costume. The first spoon was a double-boiled chicken broth Alvarez kept for moments like funerals and kings. It had been simmering since dawn, bones leached of their essence, ginger breath, scallion whisper. Naomi accepted the spoon first, not to position herself, but to shield Alvarez from the risk of a cultural misstep. She blew once, tasted, and closed her eyes because eyes are the first liars and must be quieted for truth to arrive on the tongue. Memory surged. A Chinatown kitchen where an auntie had once corrected her tones with tough love and fed her something that tasted like being forgiven. She opened her eyes and said in Mandarin, "The broth understands restraint." Liang tasted. He did not nod. He breathed a little deeper. That was enough. A line cook approached with a tray. Little bites Alvarez called translations. One was lotus root shaved so thin the light wrote poems through it, dressed with black vinegar and honey like a difficult marriage that had learned to dance. Another was steamed halibut napped with soy as clean as a bell. A third was a small bowl of glass noodles bright with scallion, a kind dish, the kind that says, "We see you, and you are not an inconvenience." Liang asked for tea, not at the suite where ceremony's easy, but here where ceremony must share a bench with utility. Water temperature became philosophy. A pantry cook reached for the kettle with the impatience of youth. Naomi touched the steel with the back of her fingers, feeling for that pre-boil tremor, and said in Mandarin, "Now," in the voice you use when a child's fever breaks. The leaves fell, sank, and then hovered, pale green commas drafting a letter to the air. The cook watched her watch the cup and understood something no manual had explained. Hospitality is attention wearing a uniform. Ling drank. He did not compliment. He did not correct. He set the cup down with the certainty of a man whose mind had just been moved 1 inch toward yes. Then came the moment sincerity likes best, the unplanned one. A young server, new enough to shine, burst through the corridor with a tray crowned in plates. The corner of the tray kissed the stainless steel of a prep table, jolting a pyramid of ramekins that had been stacked with faith. The server froze, panic blanching him. The tray wobbled. The kitchen inhaled. Liang stepped aside with the grace of a man who has been bumped before and did not mistake it for disrespect. Naomi spoke in Mandarin, low and amused, sharing a quick joke about kitchens, near misses, and aunties who have seen worse. The assistants laughed with relief, and the server, eyes wet with gratitude, regained equilibrium and fled like a deer spared. Adrian exhaled a breath he had been holding since childhood. He hadn't done anything. That was the point. Sincerity, he realized, would never be about his performance. It would be about how much room he could make for other people's goodness to do its work. One of the assistants asked, politely, almost shyly, whether they might see staff dining. Adrian did not flinch. In some properties, the cafeteria is a bruise you cover. Here it was decent. Vinyl tables that had seen the wars and survived, a steam table of stewed beans and braised meat, a pan of roasted squash that tasted like patience. A dishwasher and a hostess argued cheerfully about soccer. A line cook practiced saying, "Thank you" in Vietnamese, with a security guard whose grandmother would have corrected his tones if she had been there. Liang's gaze warmed in a way even the assistants might have missed if they had not known him as well as they did. "A building is a body," he said in Mandarin. "This one eats with dignity." Naomi translated, adding no gloss, changing nothing. On the way back, they passed the walk-in. Alvarez opened the door unceremoniously. Clean. Labeled. No shame. Transparency made a sound like crisp paper. Liang inclined his head. He did not have to. He did. In the service corridor, the air cooler, the fluorescent lights honest, Liang stopped. He spoke 3 sentences to Naomi, the weight of them pressing the air careful. Naomi turned to Adrian. He wants to see where your people sleep, she said in English, and then, sensing the tiny misinterpretation, corrected herself. He wants to understand how the hotel rests, staff housing, a phrase that can be apology or pride, depending on the day. Adrian led them without commentary. Off-site but close, the Aurelius block was small, clean, old in the kind way. The elevator smelled faintly of bleach and cumin. The hallways saved heat in winter and pretended at cool in summer. A night shift room had blackout curtains that worked because Naomi had complained until they did. Liang did not probe like an inspector. He listened like a man composing a letter to his future self. He asked about shuttles at shift change. He asked about childcare. He asked whether night staff could get soup in the cafeteria or only cold sandwiches when the moon was high. Naomi translated each question like a gift. The answers were good, not perfect. Adrian did not lie about the gaps. Ling seemed to like the gaps being named more than he would have liked the fiction of flawlessness. On the return walk, Adrian felt an unfamiliar steadiness gather in his bones. The front-of-house shine mattered, the breakfast pastry mattered, the angle of an armchair mattered. But the way a dishwasher looked at a manager when startled mattered more. Sincerity was not one thing to buy in place, it was posture. They reached the lobby again, the river unspooling light as if payment had been received. At the foot of the stairs, Liang paused. He looked at Naomi first, then at Adrian. He spoke, and Naomi did not translate immediately. She listened all the way to the end, and then chose English words that would not collapse the Mandarin. He says this house has bones he respects, she said, and he says your language today, both of yours, did not insult his intelligence. The assistants exchanged the smallest of smiles. The kind two professionals allow themselves when the day has complicated itself toward goodness. Adrian had one more thing to show, and not because chandeliers are impressive. In the suite, the tea tray waited with the note written in a hand that belonged to a concierge who practiced calligraphy on Sundays to keep her mind from breaking on screens. Liang read, and the corner of his mouth turned the way it had in the kitchen. He walked to the window, placed his palm against the glass, and let the river press back through physics, and perhaps through memory. He turned and, for the first time since the SUV door opened, he addressed Adrian directly in English. You have someone good, he said, eyes flicking to Naomi. Keep her. I intend to, Adrian said, and found that he meant the words in ways the org chart had not yet discovered how to capture. They shook hands. Ling's hand was cooler than Adrian expected. Adrian's was warmer than his worst mornings. The assistants inclined their heads. Naomi bowed a degree smaller than the first time. Respect had grown familiar without losing definition. When the elevator doors closed on Liang's party, the suite seemed to grow louder. Air, refrigeration, the building's own peculiar breath. Adrian looked at Naomi. He wanted to say 3 things at once. Thank you. Teach me. I am sorry that I did not see you until the moment I needed you. He chose the sentence Naomi had already taught him, without telling him she had. When you speak, he said, the English plain and correct, you make rooms feel larger. Naomi's smile was small, the kind of smile a person offers to beauty they don't want to scare away. Rooms are as large as the respect inside them, she said. Today was large. Back downstairs, the rhythm reasserted itself. Guests checked in, less historic than they felt. A toddler threw a soft tantrum about a fallen balloon and then forgave gravity. A bellman recovered a scarf that had risked a life of loss. In the ballroom, a new hire practiced folding napkins into sails, and then into lilies, and then into what would pass when you were too tired to care. Adrian gathered the department heads in a small conference room because gratitude without witness becomes myth. He did not speak from the head of the table. He sat in the middle like a believer among believers. He said what happened. He did not inflate. He did not edit. He told them a billionaire had asked to see not only marble, but the kitchen and where their people lay down their skulls. He said the house had not been found wanting. He said Naomi had made it so. No one applauded. Real teams don't always clap. They breathed out, some in relief, some in recalibration. The concierge with Sunday calligraphy smiled the kind of smile that asked for permission to be proud of her handwriting. Adrian gave it with a nod. After the meeting, he wrote 2 emails. One to HR, the subject line plain, title and compensation adjustment, Naomi Carter. The other to himself, scheduled to arrive in 6 months, a stubborn reminder. How large are your rooms? Measure by respect. That night, when the lobby became a mirror the river held up to the stars, Adrian sat at his desk with a notebook, and next to it, his phone set to airplane mode so the tones would not be interrupted by pings. Naomi had written 4 phrases for him on an index card, her penmanship the restrained elegance of someone who learned handwriting before screens took over. Hello? Thank you. Please take your time. And would you like tea? He practiced until the tones stopped sounding like apology and started sounding like care. Outside, the river went on doing what it had done before buildings and will do after them. Inside, a man who had built his life on Polish began to practice sincerity like a craft. The second day did not announce itself with fanfare. It arrived with the small domestic mercies that make work possible. A pair of socks found, a bus that did not break, a child's lunch packed. By 10, Adrian was walking the mezzanine with a curiosity that had replaced dread. Liang had sent a message through Enway. He would return at noon with 2 elders whose approval carried the weight of stone. He wished, if possible, to experience the house without ceremony. Elders change the physics of any room. They slow time, sometimes as a grace, sometimes as a demand. Adrian adjusted his body to their pace before they arrived. Naomi briefed the front desk on a forms of address in Mandarin that keep dignity upright without making anyone feel like they're performing a ritual they don't believe in. She reminded housekeeping that chairs become altars when backs ache. At 12:03, Liang entered with a man in an impeccable gray suit and a cane polished by years of leaning, and a woman wearing a jacket the color of a good plum. The woman's eyes had laughter tucked behind them like a blade wrapped in silk. The assistants hung back, respectful. Adrian greeted in English and a little Mandarin that did not beg for praise. Naomi greeted in Mandarin and a little English that invited the elders into the language of the house without making them pay the price of translating themselves. The woman surveyed the lobby and shook her head with a sound that was not disapproval. She spoke in Mandarin, and Naomi's smile widened as if she had been waiting her whole life to hear someone say something so precisely true. She says, Naomi translated, the chairs are arranged like a family photo where the cousins with good grades stand too close to the parents. Adrian blinked and then laughed, the kind of laugh that's actually a decision. Rotate 10 degrees, he said to the floor team. They did, and the lobby's posture changed from display to conversation. They moved as elders move, stopping when there was something to see, stopping when there wasn't, because the point was not destination, it was the way. In the ballroom, the woman asked for a microphone. She didn't test it. She told a brief story. A wedding where the rings were forgotten and a grandmother pulled red thread from her purse and tied the couple's fingers together so they wouldn't escape the promise. Naomi rendered it into English and then added, without looking at Adrian, one sentence that changed policy. In our kitchen, she said, we keep a small box of red string for emergencies. Adrian looked at her. Do we? Her eyes said, in 10 minutes. He texted Alvarez. A lacquered box appeared on the pastry station by the time they reached the exit. Red spool inside, like a myth that wanted to be real. In the suite, the elder with the cane asked for a chair facing east. He did not explain. Naomi did not translate an explanation, because explanations can be condescension in costume. She turned the chair. Adrian opened the drapes. The river flung coins of light across the carpet. The elder sat with a satisfaction that needed no narration. Then came the test of face. It's never announced. It arrives disguised as small talk. The woman asked whether the hotel had ever hosted a banquet where 2 families disagreed about how loud joy should be. Naomi translated the words in the music. Disagreement, but with love underneath. Adrian answered honestly, yes, and they had learned to negotiate volume like heat, letting elders set the thermostat. The woman nodded. Face saved on both sides. the hotel for not pretending to control what no one controls, the families for not being reduced to a problem. They asked to see staff spaces again. The elders didn't walk far, just enough to understand posture. In the cafeteria, a baker set down a tray of sesame balls as if she had known they would be needed. The elder woman took one, broke it open, and smelled it the way a mother checks a child's hair for spring. She smiled and said a sentence Naomi would think about for weeks. She says, Naomi translated quietly, that your hands understand old things. They ended at the lobby rail, where Naomi preferred to polish, because habit is a place. The woman took Naomi's hands in both of hers, a gesture that in some rooms is theater, and in this room, today, was lineage, and said 16 words that made Naomi's eyes shine. She translated only the last 5 for Adrian. She says, Naomi whispered, you made her feel like her mother is still alive. After they left, Adrian retreated to his office and closed the door. The silence inside was not empty, it was crowded with images. A chair turned east, a spool of thread. A sesame ball opened like a small moon. He did not cry. He did something harder. He let the story change him in a way that would be visible to other people. By 2, an email to HR had become a meeting invite with a subject that would have sounded radical a day earlier and now felt late. Cultural liaison, role definition, and compensation. He didn't argue from charity, he argued from function. He used words like retention and pipeline and brand equity because those are the words that buy time in rooms with numbers on screens. But beneath the heat of data, he stood a different ground. We will not return to being fluent only in marble, he said. We will be fluent in people. By 5, the role existed on paper. By 6, it had a budget line. By 7, Naomi had a choice to make that was not a test. Can I keep my current hours until we cross-train housekeeping? She asked. I don't want the team to carry my promotion like a weight. Adrian nodded and felt, with a shock that made him steady his hand on the table, pride. Pride that did not accrue to him. At 8, he walked the lobby again, not to catch flaws, but to watch rooms do what rooms do when they are arranged around respect. A child slept on 2 chairs pushed together. A man in a suit took his shoes off under a table and did not feel judged by anyone who mattered. A bellwoman showed a guest how to hold a porcelain cup with 2 hands without making the guest feel corrected. And up on the mezzanine, where the building taught its managers to look down, Adrian caught his own reflection and found to his relief that he was looking across. He sent Naomi a text, then deleted it. He walked to the service corridor instead. She was there, counting linens the way accountants count blessings when they remember how. Tomorrow, he said, teach me the words for I don't know, and please show me. Naomi smiled. Those are words we can use in any language, she said, and wrote them down anyway, tones and all. And because the day had been kind, the river threw late light against the ceiling, like a benediction, and even the chandelier, which had seen more vanity than victory, seemed to approve. What if the door you have knocked on for 10 years opens quietly from the other side, opened by someone you helped feel at home? The message from Anwei arrived after the sun had slid past its fiercest hour. It was not dramatic. A soft knock on Adrian's door, a measured smile, and a request for a brief meeting in a small room away from glass and spectacle. They chose a space nobody photographed. Acoustic panels the color of oatmeal, a table with a thin scratch from some long-ago event, a window that faced the parking lot where staff traded jokes and stretched stiff backs between shifts. Liang entered with one assistant. The second waited outside like a comma holding the sentence. Naomi came because Liang had invited her with a nod that ignored organizational ladders and landed directly on respect. The room settled into a simple geometry. 3 people, 1 intention, and Wei placed a folder on the table with the economy of motion that makes service look like music. Inside lay a contract the color of prudence. Adrian felt the old brace in his chest, the automatic readiness for clauses that bite and numbers that dazzle. Liang spoke in Mandarin, business cadence, older music. Naomi listened to the end and chose English that would not flatten the meaning. Mr. Liang proposes a multi-year agreement, she said. Recurring events, seasonal delegations, advisory visits, partial exclusivity for his West Coast gatherings. In return, the hotel keeps the culinary and cultural standard you showed today. It does not fade after he boards a plane. Adrian glanced at the numbers and failed to pretend he had not. They were good. The kind of good that lengthens a runway and puts sturdier shoes on people who have walked miles in thin ones. He thought of a maintenance request that had lived in a budget margin too long. He thought of two valets who deserved more than compliments. Naomi continued, softer now. There is a clause that is not money. It names a consultant. Adrian felt his heart align. It should, he said, surprising himself with how quickly the words arrived. And Wei inclined his head. Naomi read the line aloud, then slid the page closer to Adrian so his own eyes could do the believing. Consultant, Ms. Naomi Carter. Cultural liaison and Mandarin lead. Retainer and benefits as attached. Scope, training, on-site translation, cultural systems, menu council, elder protocol, staff education. The fluorescent lights hummed a little louder for a second, then faded back into the room's breath. Somewhere down the hall, a cartwheel squeaked. Someone laughed and then tried not to. The world did not stop. It tilted a degree. This is correct, Adrian said. Not a question, a ratification. Liang signed with characters that looked like strokes a person had cared about since childhood. Adrian signed with a steadiness he had not expected. He had assumed the numbers would provide that steadiness. It came instead from the line with a name. They stood. No speeches, handshakes, a shared breath. Competence recognizing competence. At the door, Liang paused and spoke to Naomi in Mandarin, a single sentence that made her blink like someone stepping from shade into clean light. He says, Naomi translated, voice lower than before, that when he leaves his mother's city, he listens for her language. Today he heard it. When the door clicked shut, the small room felt larger, and Wei's footsteps faded. A dishwasher somewhere dropped a pan and swore with the poetry of fatigue. Adrian turned to Naomi with 10 sentences crowding his mouth. He picked the plainest one. Do you want it? He asked. Not because it is polite, because it will change your days. Naomi looked at the contract as a person looks at a new street in a familiar neighborhood. She tested slope and light and whether there was a bench. I want the work, she said. Titles do not wash sheets, but titles open doors when I knock for other people. What do you need? To not disappear from housekeeping overnight, she answered. We cross-train first. Angela steps up. 2 of the night crew want day shift. We can make that swap. And I need paid time to build a training that does not insult anyone's intelligence. You will have it, Adrian said. He meant it because he had already done the math, both literal and moral. He carried the contract to finance and HR like a person carrying a carefully wrapped instrument through a crowd. Finance loved numbers. HR loved precedent. Both paused at the same phrase. Housekeeper to liaison. Precedent made a face. Adrian did not raise his voice. He brought charts and stories together, like 2 hands holding one bowl. He showed retention curves nudging upward in teams that had felt seen over the last 48 hours. He showed a pipeline of inquiries from regions that had previously been represented in the lobby mostly by money and not by presence. He showed guest spend rising when the house felt like it could speak to a grandmother without making her translate herself. Then he told a story about a chair turned east, a spool of red string, and a sesame ball broken open that smelled like a kitchen where people remember each other. Finance leaned toward the graphs. HR leaned toward the thread. Precedent sighed and sat down. By the time the room emptied, the role was no longer an idea. It was a budget line. Adrian took a printed offer letter and found Naomi in the laundry corridor, where steam and lint and laughter lived side by side. She was teaching a new hire a trick with wide sheets. Knuckles up, she said. Let the cotton know who is boss. The new hire laughed and the sheet obeyed. When they were alone, Adrian offered the letter. Naomi did not take it right away. What is the pay bump? She asked. Practical first, he told her. It was fair without pretending to be fortune. It meant Malik could look at a college brochure without doing the math that ends in no. It meant a better pair of shoes and dental cleanings before pain instead of after. She read the letter all the way through, lips moving on the legal parts. I will do it, she said, on one condition. Name it. I keep 2 housekeeping shifts each week until Angela says she does not need me. Deal, Adrian said. He felt pride arrive without asking for credit. He let it sit. Naomi folded the letter into her bag like a map she intended to use and sent 2 texts to her son. We are moving forward. Rice tonight. Triumph tastes better on a full plate. Cultural liaison was more than a line on paper. It was a calendar. Naomi drew hers by hand because paper forces you to see time as a garden you must tend. Week 1, 4 words that change rooms. Hello. Thank you. Excuse me. Take your time. Teach tones by tying them to breath, not fear. Week 2, tea temperatures and showing up with 2 hands. Why water matters. How to hold a cup like you mean it. Who pours first? Who drinks last? Week 3, elders, face, and the 10-degree turn chairs as respect, volume as love, disagreement that does not make anyone smaller. Week 4, kitchens as language schools, menu as memory, shortcuts that break trust, creativity that does not counterfeit. She taped the schedule in the break room beside a cartoon of a dumpling the pastry cook had drawn with a grin. The first session drew an unlikely congregation. 3 housekeepers on break, 2 bell attendants with coats still damp from a drizzle, a banquet captain with a pen held like a small sword, the concierge who practiced calligraphy on Sundays, a line cook with half an apron still on, a security guard who watched the door because the world keeps moving while you learn. Naomi began with ni hao. She did not perform. She split the word into parts, then knit it back together, let them hear the fall of the 3rd tone, and write it like a funny little hill. Adults laughed the first time, the way adults do when their mouths are asked to learn humility. She refused to let shame enter the room. We do not make fun of trying, she said. That is a rule here now. She told them about a grandmother who had corrected her tones and fed her soup so clear it tasted like an apology accepted. She watched shoulders lower until voices could come out without armor. In the kitchen session, she stood beside Alvarez and brewed tea 3 times with 3 waters. A bully boil that bruised the leaves. A bubbling patience that coaxed their sweetness. That shy pre-boil that gives room for the leaf to speak. She did not scold when someone muttered good enough. She told a story about her own mistake and the time she had poured water too hot and watched Long Jing turn bitter enough to demand forgiveness. Alvarez saw the room lean forward. He remembered why he had stayed in kitchens these many years. Not for applause. For this. Between sessions, she handled work that titles never list. A banquet diagram for a family who needed a careful distance between cousins who had not spoken in years. A front desk script that replaced no problem with my pleasure and changed the weather in 3 syllables. A quiet talk with security about posture at night so that protection felt like presence and not pressure. Adrian watched from the doorway of each session and resisted the urge to take over. Old habits tugged at him, habits dressed as leadership. He let them tug and did not move. He began to understand that his job was not to speak first, it was to make space and then keep it safe. Late that afternoon, a message arrived from Liang's team. The elders wished to return the next day. No fanfare, no extra cars. They wanted to visit as people, not as a delegation. Adrian read the note twice, then closed his eyes for a second. He thought of the chair facing east. He thought of red string in a lacquered box. He thought of a sesame ball open like a small moon. He texted Naomi, visitors at noon, same pace as yesterday. She sent back a single check mark and then a second one. That was their new language for we will be ready and we will be kind. On his way out that night, Adrian passed the mezzanine rail. The chandelier hung in its patient orbit. The river outside kept riding light across the floor. He rested his hands on the brass and felt the faint warmth of polish and work. For years he had believed that polish was the whole craft. Tonight he knew better. The shine mattered, yes, but it was the hands behind the shine that had changed the shape of his house. He headed down the service corridor. The laundry thumped. Someone sang off key and happily. Naomi stood with Angela at a whiteboard sketching a coverage grid that would let 2 people take vacations without anyone drowning. They were not speaking Mandarin. They were speaking structure. It sounded like music. Tomorrow, Adrian said, teach me the phrases, for I do not know, and please show me. I would like to stop pretending. Naomi grinned. Those phrases work in every language, she said, and wrote them for him anyway. He practiced the tones there in the hallway, under fluorescent lights, with a cart squeaking nearby and the smell of soap in the air. No marble. No river view, just work, attention, and the slow pleasure of getting one small thing right. Success walks into a room with flowers and applause, and 5 minutes later its cousins arrive, rumor and resentment. The first sign was small, a brittle smile from a senior concierge who had worked the front desk since the carpet smelled new. He congratulated Naomi on the new title and then pronounced the word precedent with the tact of a person placing a glass down just a little too hard. The second sign was louder, a forwarded note from an investor who liked phrases such as guardrails and our brand promise, and who asked in carefully neutral sentences whether a housekeeper to liaison transition signaled mission drift. Adrian read the email twice and felt the old reflex rise, the desire to write a reply so polished it could be used as a mirror. He stopped himself and walked the building instead, the cure he had been learning for problems that sit too easily in the inbox. In the lobby, a bell attendant practiced the new Mandarin greetings, his tones wobbling and then finding a center, and a guest smiled without exactly knowing why. In the kitchen, Alvarez was tasting broths and correcting salt with the patience of a monk. In housekeeping, Angela stood at a whiteboard, laying out shifts in a grid that would let two mothers attend parent-teacher conferences without leaving anyone to drown in laundry. These were not mission drift. These were the mission finally remembering itself. Still, the building has its own gossip circuits. In a corner near the service elevator, two supervisors traded theories about fairness. In a break room, someone suggested the liaison role would be a detour on the path to a real promotion. Naomi heard fragments and let them keep their air, then began work on a meeting that would not be theater. She booked a small ballroom, asked HR to attend but not dominate, and printed 3 questions on paper that did not shout. What are you afraid of? What would help you? What do you want this house to be known for? They called it a forum because the word meeting had been overused to mean a place where a manager talks and everyone else takes turns pretending. The room filled without coaxing, housekeepers and front desk agents and banquet captains sat near people they did not usually sit near. Engineering stood in the back the way they always did, ready to bolt if a pump cried out. The union steward sat with a notebook and a look that said she had seen many versions of this movie and was open to being surprised. Adrian stood up only long enough to say that he would not be speaking much. HR introduced themselves and then introduced silence. After a minute, a dishwasher with a voice that sounded like early morning spoke. He said he wanted work that did not grind down the body so hard that the mind went dull. He said respect tasted better than cake, although cake was also welcome. A banquet captain admitted that she was afraid of training sessions that felt like scolding. A concierge, older, careful, owned his worry that guests who had paid for marble might feel confused if the hotel appeared to be bending itself toward one group. Naomi thanked each person and repeated back what she had heard, not to parrot, but to prove she had been listening with more than ears. When the room had warmed, she stood beside a flip chart and drew 3 columns. In the first, she wrote costs of the change. In the second, benefits so far. In the third, unkept promises. Then she did something managers rarely do. She put numbers where numbers belonged and stories where stories would do more work. Retention had improved in 2 departments since the first trainings, not because of magic, but because kindness had become policy. Complaints had dipped in categories such as staff seemed rushed and staff looked through me and staff did not understand my request. The house had booked 2 events that would have gone to a competitor where the linens were newer, but the welcome was thin. On the unkept promises side, she wrote night shift soup and safe rides home after late banquets and daycare arrangements better than everyone begging grandparents. People nodded. Engineering promised to audit the cafeteria lines at 2 in the morning. Alvarez said the soup would be there by Friday and that it would not taste like punishment. Security volunteered to adjust late-night coverage on the staff shuttle routes. The union steward wrote for 15 minutes and then spoke 1 sentence that rearranged the air. We want the same thing, she said, and pointed at the 3rd column. We want you to keep your promises. After the forum, Adrian took 2 long walks, one through the glamorous rooms and one through the honest ones. He wrote answers to the investor's email with his feet and gave the reply words later. He refused to hide behind jargon. He told the truth that the contract was good for the building. He said that the role had been created because the house had found a voice inside itself that it wanted to use with more people. He closed with a sentence he had not been brave enough to write a year ago. Our brand promise is not a chandelier. It is how people leave feeling larger than when they arrived. There were smaller storms. A colleague at a competing property sent a message with a smile that cut. Heard you went folksy. Another wrote to HR at the Aurelius with a resume that listed superficial buzzwords and nothing about patience. Two department heads tried to retake ground they had never owned, suggesting every decision run through their desks for efficiency. Adrian thanked them, then declined, and attached a note from finance showing that sincere service had already improved spend and loyalty in a way that no seasonal decor ever had. Numbers deployed without cruelty silenced the argument. Naomi took one shot across the bow personally. A senior concierge, the same man with the brittle smile, stopped her near the elevators and said, with ice-thin courtesy, that some guests preferred the hotel to be gracefully neutral on culture. Naomi did not harden. She asked him whether he preferred it when a guest confessed that a hotel felt like everywhere and nowhere at once. He hesitated. She told him a story about an elder who had asked for a chair to face east, and how turning it had cost nothing and earned the kind of loyalty no loyalty program could purchase. He nodded, not in surrender, but in recognition that some arguments do not require winners, they require witnesses. The final piece in the backlash came wrapped as something helpful. An investor suggested that the liaison role be confined to wealthy guests from a short list of countries the firm watched closely. Naomi did not even have to speak. Adrian responded with a single page that had two photographs. In one, a billionaire at a banquet smiled like a man who had found a cousin. In the other, a single father checked into the Aurelius for a night he could barely afford so he could take his daughter to a college tour in the morning. And a front desk agent had said, "Take your time," in a tone that moved tears to the edge without letting them fall. Adrian wrote one line under the photos. "We are not bilingual for billionaires only. We are bilingual because that is what a house is for." By month's end, the gossip had spent itself and something quieter remained. People liked hearing themselves get better at a sound. Guests lingered longer in the lobby, not for the marble, but because the chairs knew how to hold conversations. The investor who had worried about mission drift sent an apology disguised as a lunch invitation. Adrian accepted and chose a table by the window, where he could see staff cross the porte cochere, with a rhythm that now matched the building's heartbeat. Chapter 6. The Mother Tongue. The first large banquet under the new agreement arrived on a night that felt like the hotel had been waiting for it since the day the first brick met mortar. The foundation was throwing a celebration for a slate of new schools that would open in cities where children had been told their language did not belong in classrooms. The guest list looked like a map drawn by a poet. Professors with shoes dusty from visits to villages, and board members who could recite lines of poetry in dialects most applications did not recognize. Engineers who had built water systems that run on cleverness and patience, and elders who remembered when patience was the only grid they had. Naomi planned in arcs rather than lists. She sat with Alvarez and built a menu that allowed memory to eat without apology. This was not fusion, it was respect with a stove. Steamed fish that tasted like clean promises. Lotus root that crunched the way a good lesson ends. A soup clear enough that grief could see to the bottom. She found a vendor for fresh lotus root who delivered in the half-light before morning. Finance frowned at the invoice and then relaxed when Naomi pointed at the projected waste reduction from guests finishing what they had been served. She coached the floor like a choir director. 2 hands for tea, not because one is insufficient, but because 2 hands say, "I am here." Serve elders first. Let laughter choose the volume. If someone asks for a story, give them one from the house, not the brochure. She hung a small sign at the staff entrance to the ballroom. When in doubt, slow down by one breath. They rehearsed the 10-degree rotation of tables that had become the building's quiet hallmark. The stage moved away from the chandelier's echo. Chairs for elders received cushions. The microphones were tested with sentences rather than numbers. "Please be kind to my mistakes," said a young server into a mic, and the sound came back warm. The first guests arrived early in the way elders do, in order to bless the room without ceremony. Naomi greeted them in Mandarin and Cantonese where it fit, in English where it helped, and in that open language of posture everywhere. She introduced three elders to the pastry cook and asked him to show them the red string box. He did, shy, and one of the women laughed and tied a loose loop around his finger for luck. The cook, who was 24 and learning how to be kneaded, wore the loop under his sleeve all night. A small crisis landed on soft feet. Table 9 avoided pork for reasons that did not fit neatly into a line on a banquet ticket. A server misheard, set down a platter, and saw the faces around the table shift inward as if a wind had turned cold. Naomi was beside them in 10 steps, her apology wrapped in the right grammar of care. She removed the dish without drama, brought noodles that shone with scallion and sesame, and placed her palm lightly, respectfully, on the table's edge in a gesture she had learned from an auntie who had smoothed many storms. She said one word in Mandarin that meant peace in a way the body could hear. The elder at the table tapped the rim of her bowl once. Permission granted for joy to return. The speeches honored work rather than ego. A teacher from a new school told a story about a child who had written an essay in a language that her father spoke, and her principal did not, and how the essay made them both cry for different reasons until they began to cry for the same ones. An engineer explained how a pipe bends like a sentence and holds water the way a patient person holds anger, with shape. People ate, listened, laughed, and the room settled into the comfortable geometry of a family that knows it can disagree without breaking. Adrian stood at the edge, not as a sentinel, but as a student. He watched a server choose to wait an extra 2 seconds before clearing a plate and saw how those 2 seconds changed everything. He watched Alvarez walk the perimeter of the kitchen with a satisfied exhaustion that looked like love. He watched Naomi stand with an elder under the mezzanine and speak softly until the elder's shoulders eased. And then he watched Naomi leave before thanks could make the elder feel small. In the middle of the evening, Liang rose. He did not make his speech from the stage. He stood beside his table and spoke in Mandarin that Naomi carried without hurry. He thanked the people who had brought the house to this night, and he thanked the house for being a house, not a showroom. He spoke about mothers and the way they twist language into small ropes that pull children across hard places. He spoke about how a city can be emptied of its mother tongue and still remember the taste of it in tea. His last sentence did not need translation. He said the hotel's name and the word home in the same breath. After dessert, guests lingered in the lobby as if trying to catch something that was leaving the air. A girl no older than 12 climbed a stair and looked up into the chandelier as if it were a tree full of singing glass. Her father started to tell her not to and then stopped, seeing what Adrian saw. That wonder is not a stain you wipe away. Naomi walked over and asked the girl whether she wanted to see the lobby from the mezzanine. The girl nodded, and the three of them climbed slowly. At the rail, Naomi taught the girl how to press her palms against the brass so that her fingerprints would not mark it, a trick wrapped around a lesson about care. The night ended with the administrative work that keeps glory from becoming a hangover. Naomi walked with security through the staff parking lot and made sure the lights that had been flickering were replaced. She checked with the shuttle driver about the late run. In the kitchen, she thanked the night team for the soup they had promised and kept. In housekeeping, she left a note for the early crew that said the ballroom was theirs again, and that the elders had blessed the room without anyone noticing. At his desk, after the last guest had folded into cars and the river had taken back the reflections, Adrian opened his drawer and touched the index card Naomi had written for him. When you speak, do not try to sound impressive. Try to sound careful. He practiced a sentence out loud just once, a simple welcome, and heard in his own voice a thing that had not been there a year ago. It was not fluency. It was belonging to the work. Before he turned off his lamp, he wrote a note to himself and taped it inside the drawer beside the card. Remember the red string. Remember the chair facing east. Remember the soup at 2 in the morning. Remember that mother tongue is not only Mandarin or Vietnamese or Spanish. Mother tongue is the way a house says to a tired person, you can set your weight down here. He closed the drawer gently, the way you close a door when someone you love is sleeping in the next room, and went home to a city that sounded at last like it had learned a few new words. Storms announce themselves in hotels long before the first raindrop lands. Engineers feel it in pressure readings nobody else watches. Housekeepers feel it in the way curtains lift as if bracing. Front desk agents feel it in guest eyes. That tiny plea that says, please tell me the world will keep working, even if the sky decides otherwise. On a Thursday that had been gentle until lunch, the Aurelius began to hum at a different frequency, and Naomi heard it the way a musician hears a key change from the hallway. The forecast had been casual at dawn. By noon, the river carried a bruise-colored sheen, and the glass on the east side of the lobby stuttered with wind like a heartbeat gone wrong. The city app pushed a warning: heavy rain, possible flooding near waterfront roads, power interruptions likely. Adrian looked up from a budget revision, saw the sky turn the color of pewter, and closed his laptop on a sentence that would have to finish itself later. The banquet could not move. It was not rich people toasting themselves. It was a memorial for a community leader whose work had made the city's most fragile houses hold together through 3 winters and a pandemic that left the air permanently suspicious. Families had traveled in borrowed cars and on buses that coughed like old men. Elders had promised to speak and had practiced at kitchen tables all week. To postpone was to disrespect a promise to the dead, and grief has an exquisite memory for disrespect. Adrian called a huddle in the small office behind the front desk. Engineering, security, events. Alvarez from the kitchen, his whites already replaced with a gray shirt because you do not put your best fabric between yourself and a storm. Naomi stepped in last, having sent 3 text messages on the walkover that would matter later. One to the shuttle driver about extended loops, one to her son about homework and the soup in the fridge, one to Angela to put extra towels at every door that opened to the weather. We assume power loss, Adrian said. We assume it returns. We plan for it not to. Elevators? Generators cover 1 bank, engineering answered. We'll move elders and anyone with mobility issues into rooms on lower floors before the service. Kitchen? Cold backups for hot dishes, Alvarez said. 2 courses we can finish with fire alone. 1 dessert that tastes like comfort even at room temperature. Security? Front door teams for slipping hazards, the chief replied. Shuttle escorts with umbrellas. Coordinated radio checks every 15 minutes. We station by the staff lot. We walk anyone who asks. Naomi waited for the gaps. Candles, she said. Not smell. Unscented, steady. Place them where hands can't get stupid. Tissues at aisle ends. Move some chairs closer. People will want to be near each other when the lights go. Have the quartet play quieter if the rain gets loud. Not to compete, to accompany. Adrian nodded. He had learned to trust the sentences Naomi began with, when and if rather than should. They were stronger than orders. The rain came as if it had been impatient all morning. It drummed the glass with a rhythm that made even the chandelier look concerned. Guests arrived damp but intact, umbrellas refusing their shapes at the door like arguments that had given up. Valet worked a wet ballet. Housekeeping triage carpets with runners. A bell attendant slipped once and caught himself with a grin that told everyone watching they were allowed to laugh at physics and still respect it. In the ballroom, events had executed Naomi's diagram with the precision of a surgeon's team. 10 degrees of kindness had been rotated into the room. Aisles widened for wheelchairs, chairs for elders cushioned, microphones tested with phrases that mattered. May their memory be a blessing, someone said into a mic. The sound came back whole. Naomi checked the red string box and found it there. Small, faithful, absurd, perfect. The service began under lights that behaved. A niece spoke first, voice shaking, fingers steady on the paper. She told a story about the way her uncle had fixed a leak with a bucket and a prayer in a new roof 2 months later when a grant came through. A friend from work spoke next, while Alvarez watched the kitchen clock, counting backward from soup ladling. The quartet laid down a soft floor of sound. Adrian stood at the back with security, not guarding, just being present with a posture that suggested the building itself was listening. Then the lights died. Power does not simply leave. It withdraws with a small gasp and an apology that the circuits are not capable of pronouncing. The room inhaled sharply and did not scream because the room had been taught how to behave. The generator caught the emergency outlets, a few exit signs humming to life like calm counselors. Candles flickered into meaning, 100 small suns placed exactly where Naomi had said they should be. The rain pressed its face against the glass and sang louder. A child cried, and then stopped when her grandmother squeezed her hand twice. The niece at the microphone looked out into a new kind of light and made a choice that would become legend at family tables for years. She kept speaking. Her voice grew larger without the amplification, aided by a silence that the staff guarded with their bodies. The quartet, who had been trained for Bach and weddings, did something better. They stopped, then picked up a single note and held it, very soft, like a hand under the speaker's courage. Naomi moved quietly to the side doors, placed her palm flat against the frame to feel the draft, then signaled to events to pull the extra runners into place. She walked the back row and tucked a shawl around a woman whose shoulders had begun to shiver more from nerves than from cold. She whispered to security, who adjusted their stance so that their presence felt like a wall with windows, not a barricade. She nodded to Alvarez, who had shifted his plan without complaint. Soup would arrive later, not hotter, but the kind they were making could hold its heart even with the burner off. In the kitchen, the night team had already lit butane with steady hands. Cooks smiled the tired smiles of people who have done harder things in worse rooms. A pastry assistant who had never plated by candlelight before steadied his own hands by counting breaths. Alvarez moved among them, not barking, just saying the one sentence that he had learned reassures cooks more than any other. We know how to do this. The lights returned with a blush, embarrassed at their lapse. A cheer threatened. Naomi lifted her hand, small, and the room heard the gesture and chose gratitude without noise. The niece finished. An elder stood with help, told a story that made half the front row cry, and the other half remember why they had come. The service flowed again, but softer, as if everyone understood they had been given proof that grief and love are both louder than rain. Dinner slid from the kitchen with a grace that would have looked easy to anyone who did not know the choreography it requires. Servers moved on the new aisles like they had been born in them. Soup landed gently, steam rising like hope that had taken the shape of scent. Alvarez watched a line cook lift a lid and smiled because the aroma was right. Naomi watched the elder at table 3 taste, nod, and relax a fraction into her chair. She allowed herself one breath of satisfaction and then kept walking. Outside the ballroom, the lobby had turned into a harbor for strays. Guests whose rooms were not ready because the storm had trapped the housekeeping carts on the wrong floors sat with towels around their shoulders like monks. A couple whose car had stalled in a puddle phoned their mechanic while a valet quietly texted his cousin, who tinkered on nights. A toddler in red boots stamped in a puddle by the revolving door and was forgiven. Adrian authorized coffee and hot chocolate to flow to the lobby without counting cups first, because there are moments when you pay the bill later. A competitor texted him a snide message. Heard you lost power. Hope your chandelier's waterproof. Adrian looked at the words, then at the candles, then at the room where people were choosing to be noble with each other for an hour. He put his phone face down and went to roll a towel under a leaking door, because sometimes the best answer is work. When dessert came, the rain relented as if it had been listening and was for once in the mood to cooperate. The quartet played the last piece without amplification, and the sound feathered against the glass like light wings. Families lingered. The staff moved slowly on purpose. Time was given extra room. After the formalities, the building shifted into its other duty, the one contracts never name. People needed to get home. Naomi walked the staff lot with security, checking the corner lights that had flickered earlier. Engineering met them with a ladder and a headlamp, and the kind of grin that knows small victories count. Shuttle loops extended themselves. The driver, who could thread a bus through hail and gossip with equal skill, coordinated with the front desk to avoid leaving anyone behind. A bell attendant made a poor umbrella into a decent one with a piece of tape and a sense of humor. The storm, having failed to conquer, settled for leaving gifts. Branches, pools, the smell of clean. In the quiet after, the ballroom belonged to the tired again. Events and housekeeping moved through the debris with a practiced tenderness that never got old. Naomi tucked leftover candles away for the next wedding or vigil or Unforecasted power company apology. She found the red string box and lifted the lid like a superstitious person and a scientist at the same time. There it was, the spool, patient. She smiled and left it where it belonged. Adrian walked the building the way captains walk decks after storms. He touched railings. He said thank you until the word felt like a melody with 3 notes. He reached the kitchen at the tail end of cleanup. Alvarez sat on a milk crate eating a piece of cake from a pan with a spoon meant for soup. Adrian took the spoon when it was offered. The cake tasted like sugar, exhaust, and the relief of having done a hard thing without hurting anyone. You know, Alvarez said, scraping the corner, I once cooked a wedding in a hurricane. The bride went barefoot. Best service of my life until tonight. What made it the best? Adrian asked. The way everyone looked at each other, Alvarez said, like they were on the same team. Adrian nodded. That's Naomi, he said. She makes rooms, remember that. She makes rooms, Alvarez corrected, and then gets out of their way. On his way back to the office, Adrian stopped under the mezzanine, where the chandelier hung with its usual, expensive patience. He thought of the morning he had believed the chandelier was the hotel's signature. It was, he admitted, a lovely signature. Tonight, though, the house had signed its name with candles and soup and a girl in red boots and a niece who had kept speaking without a microphone. The signature felt sturdier. He found Naomi in the service corridor, loading a cart with laundry bags in a way that made the cart behave, even though it had a limp. She looked tired around the eyes and alive everywhere else. You were right about the quartet, he said, and the chairs, and the candles, and every other thing. She shrugged the way people shrug when they hope compliments will not take root in the wrong places. Storms are easy, she said, and then laughed at her own arrogance. That's not true. Storms are honest. They show you if your systems are lies. He leaned on the cart, felt its wheel complain, and said the thought he had not been able to stop thinking. A year ago, the lights going out would have been a catastrophe. A year ago, Naomi said, we would have tried to beat the rain by raising our voices. Today we listened to it and spoke softer. He nodded. Teach that, he said. She smiled. That's the plan. When he finally sat at his desk, the email from the investor who had worried about mission drift was waiting. Adrian opened it. The man had been at the memorial. He wrote 6 sentences that could have been 3, and then, after clearing his throat on paper twice, wrote the only one that mattered. I think you are onto something that has nothing to do with decor. Adrian typed a reply that did not gloat. Thank you for coming. We are trying to be a house in every sense of the word. He turned off the lamp. The river muttered its unending sentence. Somewhere, a dishwasher laughed at a joke a line cook told badly. In a city that had held its breath all afternoon, sleeping started like rain does, slowly, then everywhere at once. Reckoning days arrive without thunder. They show up on calendars as neutral blocks of time, and then proceed to age you 5 years in an afternoon. The invite that set this one in motion was beige and polite, the kind of outlook rectangle that hides sharp teeth. Quarterly review with legacy investors, agenda to include contract performance, budget variance, and strategic direction. Adrian stared at it the way a swimmer looks at a lake in winter. He had crossed waters like this before, but never with so much of the hotel's new soul riding on a single conversation. He woke early, before the river pulled light through the glass. In the dark kitchen of his apartment, he made coffee and wrote 3 lists on a pad he saved for days like this. Numbers we can prove, stories only we can tell, promises we have not yet kept. He had learned that each list matters, and that the meeting would turn false if any one of them was missing. The easy days of hiding behind occupancy graphs were gone. He was grateful and a little afraid. At 8, he walked the hotel the way sailors touch their ship before a long storm. Housekeeping had already softened the lobby with quiet competence. Engineering checked a stubborn sensor in an air handler that liked to pretend it was broken whenever the weather changed its mind. The concierge with Sunday calligraphy practiced a sentence in Mandarin under her breath while polishing a stack of room keys as if they were small tablets of gold. The building did not look nervous. It looked ready to be judged by people who knew how little a spreadsheet can see. Naomi arrived with a folder so thin it looked like a citrine envelope rather than a shield. She carried it with the unconcern of someone who trusted what was inside. She had chosen her clothes with the same care she chose words for a fragile conversation. A dark dress that did not apologize for being practical. A small pair of earrings that looked like seeds. A scarf tucked just enough to suggest color without demanding attention. She had told herself long ago that she would never dress for rooms where people needed to be reminded she belonged. She dressed for the work. They met in Adrian's office for 10 minutes of quiet before the show. He slid a copy of his lists across the desk. She read them quickly, then upside down for fun, and smiled without drama. Numbers we can prove, he said. Revenue from the Liang agreement and 2 subsequent bookings that had sprouted from its roots. Spend per cover at culturally literate events compared to the same periods last year. Return stays attributed in guest notes to feeling understood, a word that rarely appears in hotel software and therefore matters more when it does. Staff retention, improvements in housekeeping and banquets. Small but real, the kind you do not celebrate publicly because the gods of jinxed outcomes are listening. Stories only we can tell, she said, tapping the second list. The chair turned east, the red string box, the soup at 2 in the morning, the power cut in the niece who kept speaking while the rain played accompaniment, the elder who said you made me feel like my mother is still alive, the concierge who replaced no problem with my pleasure and watched an exhausted traveler relax simply because the word pleasure had been allowed into the room. Promises we have not yet kept, they said together, because this list belonged to both of them. Night shift soup now an institution, but the staff shuttle coverage still spotty on the late second loop. A childcare pilot still in proposals and forms, waiting for a green light from the people who think liability is the only language worth knowing. Cross-training and housekeeping halfway complete because schedules are puzzles and school pickup times are laws of physics not easily bent. She closed the folder and set both hands on it, palms down, like a person steadying a map. Let them talk first, she said. They came with fear. If we don't give it a place to sit, it will run around breaking things. He nodded. He had been that kind of fear in other rooms, the kind that wears a suit and mimics concern while pacing like a trapped animal. He checked his phone, saw a text from Alvarez that simply said, "Cake in staff room in case blood sugar fails," and sent back a heart emoji he would not have allowed himself a year ago. Then he and Naomi walked to the conference room toward the back of the mezzanine, the one with the too thick door and the view of the service alley instead of the river. Investors like to meet where they cannot be seen, as if secrecy were part of fiduciary duty. 3 of them were there already. Mr. Phelps, who had made his first money packaging fruit juice in boxes and his second money licensing a cartoon duck, sat with his reading glasses down on his nose and a legal pad he still preferred to screens. Mrs. O'Garner, whose talent for turning hospitals into profit machines had left her with a precision that made nurses nervous, watched the doorway with the bored intensity of a cat at a rodent's hole. Mr. Chow, younger, newer, leaned back in his chair with a practiced casualness that read as defensive to people who had learned to scan body language on sight. 2 more joined by video, squares that would contribute interruption more than insight. Pleasantries crashed into their usual rocks. Adrian sat, thanked them for time, and then did what Naomi had told him to do. He listened to fear. Phelps worried that catering to specific cultures would confuse the Aurelius brand, which he described as cosmopolitan, as if cosmopolitan were a flavor that never offended anyone because it secretly tasted like nothing. Garner wanted to know how much of the new spend was a sugar high from novelty. Chow raised a risk that had an edge. What happens if Mr. Liang pulls out? The video squares gave those emphatic nods people give when they are 12 inches tall and cannot be touched. Naomi sat quietly, the stillest person in the room, which made the room watch her even when eyes pretended not to. Adrian took a breath and began with numbers we can prove. He had rehearsed his paragraphs the way he once rehearsed greetings for a head of state. He told them what they thought they wanted to hear in a way that kept his dignity intact. Contract revenue to date, pipeline expansion along friendship lines rather than pure sales hustle, expense discipline maintained even with thoughtful ingredients and a handful of nice things like new cushions for the elders' chairs because no investment in comfort is ever wasted. The graphs did their hissing dance on the screen. Phelps's glasses went up and down. Garner's face did not change because it had been trained not to. Chow asked two sharp questions that helped more than they hurt. Adrian answered. The room did not relax into applause. It tilted an inch toward neutral, which is the cliff edge of approval in rooms like this. Then he put the graphs down, literally. He closed the laptop and left the last slide frozen in the background like a departing god. He looked at Naomi and nodded once. She did not take the head of the table. She remained where she was and told stories. She made them specific and unglamorous. The chair turned east, the red string box, the soup at 2 in the morning, the power cut that taught the hotel it did not have to perform to be noble. She did not cast herself as the heroine. She cast the hotel as a place where people could become the kind of people they wanted to be. Garner interrupted at the red string, her voice a scalpel. Are we a hotel, she asked, or a community center? Naomi smiled in a way that acknowledged both the edge and the question behind it. We are a house, she said. Community centers sometimes forget how to make a bed. Hotels sometimes forget what a house is for. Phelps looked up from his pad, eyes curious despite himself. And what is a house for? He asked, the tone disarming, the content a test. To let tired people set their weight down, she said, without anyone making them feel smaller. The weight can be money, grief, joy, language. We take all of it well, or we will be replaced by something with better marble and worse manners. Chow folded his arms, but his mouth tilted, as if he had tasted something he did not expect to like. Garner did not relent. Your role is unusual, she said. Housekeeper to liaison in a quarter sounds like speed for a resume, not stability for a system. Naomi did not flinch. I agree that speed can be dangerous if the person moving fast is not also taking care, she said. We are cross-training. I still do 2 housekeeping shifts a week because you do not abandon a team because a title changed. We are building a program that outlives my presence. Ask me for the syllabus. She slid a single page across the table. It had no clip art. It had dates, topics, and the names of people who would teach things they knew not from TED Talks, but from grandmothers and Thursday nights and kitchens full of steam. 4 words that change rooms. Tea, temperatures, and showing up with 2 hands. Elders, face, and the 10-degree turn. Kitchens as language schools. Phelps read, his glasses halfway up again. Garner glanced, then set it down as if to punish paper for existing. Chow's eyes rested on the line that said, we will not make fun of trying, and blinked once, slowly. Adrian took the opening. We are not performing diversity, he said. We are learning fluency. There's a difference you can feel at the door. One is an apology for being late to a conversation. The other is an invitation to stay. Garner inhaled, ready to say something about liability and scope creep. Phelps surprised everyone by speaking first. I went to my grandson's school last week, he said, eyes on his legal pad. They teach the kids to apologize with a sentence that has 3 parts. I'm sorry. I understand why it hurt. Here is what I will do differently. Hotels are very good at the first sentence. I have rarely heard the second and third in a lobby. Ms. Carter, you sound like the second and the third. Naomi inclined her head. We are practicing, she said. We still get it wrong. We take notes and get better. Chow leaned forward. Let me be the villain for a second, he said, performing a self-awareness that would have been charming in a different room. If Mr. Liang pulls out, what remains besides some staff who know a handful of Mandarin phrases and a red string box in the pastry kitchen? A better hotel, Adrian said, not performing anything. A team that has learned to see, a building that knows how to host without auditioning. Guests who will tell their friends they felt something here. Not because it was fancy, but because it was right. He pushed a single printed page across the table. 2 photos side by side. A banquet where a billionaire smiled like a cousin. A father and daughter at the front desk. The father's shoulders loosening when the agent said, "Take your time like a promise." Under the photos, 1 sentence. We are not bilingual for billionaires only. We are bilingual because that is what a house is for. Phelps laughed, a small bark of approval that surprised even him. Garner's mouth didn't soften, but her eyes did, a millimeter. Chow nodded because not nodding would have made him the only person missing the point. The video squares chimed in with time warnings. Their usefulness concluded. They moved through the rest. budget variance tiny and explainable, capital expenses deferred that now made sense to consummate, a staffing lift in banquets that did not break the model. Garner asked her last question about sustainability with admirable rigor. Adrian answered it the way he wished someone had answered him at 28, directly, with numbers, and with a story that would stick longer than any bar chart. He told them about the night the storm cut the power and the niece who kept speaking. He told them about the adult who started crying in the lobby, not because of grief, but because a bellwoman had noticed the way he was carrying his suitcase and offered to wheel it without making him feel old. He told them about Naomi coaching the quartet not to compete with Rain. He didn't dress the stories. He served them plain. The meeting ended not with a flourish, but with a set of agreements that felt like good earth. The contract would continue. The role would be formalized with a review in 6 months and a line of succession plan written by Naomi and Janine. The budget would hold with a small new allocation for the training program, labeled, at Garner's insistence, Operational Excellence, which was code that would keep skeptics happy while truth did its work. Phelps asked for a tour of staff dining next time. Chow requested a seat at the next training incognito and then laughed at himself and admitted he was incapable of blending. The video squares waved their pixelated hands and vanished. When the door closed, the room released a breath as if the building itself had lungs under the carpet. Adrian sat and let his spine find a curve again. Naomi looked at him and did not say congratulations, because that is for trophies and birthdays. She said simply, "We weren't lying," and he nodded because that was the richest compliment he had received in years. They did not go to the lobby bar to celebrate. They went to the staff room because Alvarez had left cake, and because victory tastes better among the people who re-season gravy when it separates and who wring a mop without making a speech. Housekeepers drifted in, laughing about a guest who had insisted the river be turned down because it was too loud. Engineering told a story about a pump that had asked politely for retirement by squealing only when the ballroom was empty. A valet explained to a new hire how to read the weather in a windshield. It felt like family without the parts of family that require therapy. Adrian cut 2 slices and then, remembering a habit he wanted to become instinct, offered Naomi the first piece with 2 hands. She accepted with a grin that said she noticed and did not need to narrate it. They ate in companionable quiet while the room did what staff rooms do, which is echo with banter and stubborn kindness. After a while, Naomi stood and gathered plates because titles do not wash dishes. Adrian dried because leaders dry, or else the word leader loses shape. On his way back to his office, he passed the concierge desk. The Sunday calligraphy practitioner looked up, eyes bright. "How did the reckoning go?" she asked, delighting in the drama of calling it what it was. "True and enough," he said, surprised at how perfectly the words fit. "We got to tell the truth, and it was enough." He stepped onto the mezzanine. The chandelier hung in its patient orbit. The river out the glass wrote its long sentence. He placed his palm on the brass rail Naomi had polished 1,000 times and felt, through the metal and the air and the dizzying past, the small warmth of a house that had decided what it wanted to be. He opened his drawer back at the desk and touched the index card again, the one with the sentence Naomi had written. "When you speak, do not try to sound impressive, try to sound careful." He added a second card beside it in his own hand. "When you are judged, do not try to be invincible. Try to be true." He taped it down and smiled because he knew that the next test would arrive dressed as normal days. He would be ready because he wouldn't be alone. That evening, as the lobby slid into its evening suit and the lamps did their delicate work, he found Naomi in the service corridor, writing the next week's training schedule on a whiteboard that had learned to be beautiful without help. She was adding a session led by a dishwasher named Ruth, who had taught herself 3 languages between midnight and dawn over 10 years of breaks and buses. The title read, perfectly, "How to Listen to Someone's Accent Without Making Them Work for Your Comfort." "That one," Adrian said, "might save us lawsuits." "That one," Naomi said, "might save us ourselves." They laughed and the sound carried down the corridor into laundry steam and the clink of cups and the ordinary miracles of a house that had learned how to be a house. Outside, the river kept talking. Inside, people kept answering in a dozen tongues, all of them saying the same thing in the end. "Welcome, you can set your weight down here." Some invitations change your calendar. Some change your house. Liang's arrived the way his praise always did, wrapped in understatement, a message from Wei with two sentences, tidy as origami. Mr. Liang requests your presence for a site visit and ceremony in Shanghai. Dates attached, agenda flexible. Naomi read it twice, then a third time as if the text might breathe. Adrian read it once, felt an old Bakersfield boy's panic press his lungs, passports, suits that wrinkle, jet lag like a moral test, and then felt something sturdier arrive behind it. He was not traveling as a salesman. He was traveling to learn the language of a promise they had already made. They met in Adrian's office after closing to plan with a pencil and the humility of beginners. Naomi drew a line down a pad. On one side, what we bring. On the other, what we will not pretend to bring. She filled the first column with respect, questions, a willingness to be taught, a palate ready for bitter and sour and salt without apology. She filled the second with fluency they did not have, certainty they had not earned, souvenirs. Adrian laughed at souvenirs and then wrote it down anyway, because sometimes a rule is really an incantation. Do not turn a relationship into something you store on a shelf. They flew on a weekday that left the hotel in Janine's capable hands and Alvarez's stubborn kindness. At the airport, Naomi made Adrian place all liquids into a single bag and then taught him the word for hello she preferred on planes because it sounded less like an opening salvo and more like a door quietly knocked. On the flight, she napped in the discipline of people who count sleep for survival. Adrian tried and failed. His thoughts slid between logistics and the city they were approaching. Shanghai, a name that had lived in his head all these years, mostly as a skyline and a stock market tone. He looked out the window somewhere above the Pacific and tried to imagine how a chandelier would sound in a building that looked at the river called Huangpu. He closed his eyes and practiced the tones Naomi had written on an index card for him on the walk to the gate. Hello, thank you, please show me, I don't know. They landed into a morning that looked like money had hired mist to soften the edges of bright things. Shanghai unfurled itself with an urban elegance that made other cities look like they were trying too hard. The air tasted faintly of rain and ambition. A driver waited with a paper sign that didn't say their names. It said Aurelius, as if they were a band on tour. Wei greeted them in the hotel lobby with a bow that felt like friendship disguised as formality. He took their bags in the way of a man who does not need to take bags but knows that power is sometimes spelled, please let me. The schedule is light, he said in English, which Naomi would later render for Adrian in a soft Mandarin so his ears could stretch. Mr. Liang would like to show you two houses. One is metal and glass. One is older than either of us deserves. They started with the metal and glass, the headquarters that rose like a statement from a district that had invented statements. The lobby held a sculpture that looked like air-given bone, lifts that arrived as quickly as an apology properly made, reception attendants whose faces were exercise and calm. Up top, a banquet hall without columns gazed at a city that refused to nap. Adrian did not let his mouth hang open. He let it soften. He saw the room as a set of duties rather than a trophy. He asked about sound, not capacity. He measured the distance between kitchen and stage with his feet. He had learned from Naomi that the only map that matters in hospitality is the one you can draw by walking. Lang met them on the floor with a smile that made his assistants relax. He wore a suit the color of new asphalt and a watch that told his pulse rather than the time. He greeted Naomi in Mandarin, greeting Adrian in English, then did a courteous, deliberate code switch mid-sentence that let them meet in the same paragraph. We will do a small ceremony, he said. It is not a big thing. He said big with a micro-humor that meant it would be enormous by any realistic measure. Also, my mother would like to meet you. Naomi inclined her head and felt a warmth rise that had nothing to do with rooms and everything to do with inheritance. Adrian felt his throat go suddenly dry and remembered to nod without bobbing. They walked the hall together. Liang asked Naomi's opinion of a stage that could retract. She considered acoustics before spectacle and then suggested a 10-degree turn that made the space feel less like a statement and more like a welcome. Liang laughed under his breath. 10 degrees, he said. Across oceans, still 10 degrees. They toured kitchens where steel shone with the kind of cleanliness that signals pride rather than fear. Chefs in crisp jackets moved at the speed of competence. Naomi asked a cook in Mandarin how he avoided overcooking fish in bulk service. The cook answered, a little flattered that a foreigner asked the right question. He said the trick was to pretend each fillet belonged to his grandmother. That way, he added, you imagine how soft she would want it. Naomi translated this for Adrian and watched him write it down as a policy disguised as a sentence. The second house was older than any corporate vision could make. Ling's mother lived in a lilac-painted building in a lane where laundry echoed the day's weather. The courtyard smelled of soy, ginger, and the specific peace that arises in places where people have cooked more than they have argued. An old wutong tree lifted its arms like an elder stretching. Shoes were neatly arranged by a door that had let in decades of homecomings. Ling's mother was small and fierce, a woman whose kindness had been sharpened by uses. She wore a sweater the color of egg yolk and slippers that made her 2 inches shorter than her will. She greeted Naomi first in Mandarin, then greeted Adrian in crisp, school-trained English that carried a hint of mischief. You must be the man who thinks chandeliers are the most important part of a hotel, she said, and let him see the glint in her eye that meant she was teasing him into dignity. Not anymore, Adrian said. Now I think chairs are important. And soup. She laughed and took his hand with 2 of hers. Naomi watched the contact like a blessing disguised as etiquette. They moved inside, where a table had been set not to astonish, but to feed. Bowls of tea eggs flickered with star anise. Pickled greens waited for rice that was already cooking. A dish of braised pork belly sat like an argument won, slowly and gently. It was a home table, not a banquet. Adrian felt his shoulders lower, as if they had been forgiven something he didn't know he had asked. Conversation floated like a kite. Naomi held the string. Liang's mother asked about the hotel's staff and whether the people who washed sheets had breaks that allowed their feet to forgive them. She asked whether elders were greeted first because traditions cross borders even when people don't. She asked whether there was soup at night. Naomi answered without selling, rendering Adrian's English into Mandarin with the intimacy of a daughter-in-law who had nothing to prove. She added small things that stories sometimes require: the red string box, the chair turned east, the night the lights went out and the niece kept reading. At one point, Liang's mother told a story about her own mother, a woman who had never left the province but had somehow held cities together with letters and recipes. She used to make noodles, she said, and while she stretched the dough, she would scold my father, not for being a bad man, for being proud in front of guests. She said a husband must have 2 stomachs, one for food, one for humility, so that the guest could be full without getting indigestion from watching him. Naomi translated, and Adrian laughed with the grateful discomfort of a man whose stomachs had only recently doubled. A small crisis arrived disguised as a gift. Adrian had brought coffee and dark chocolate from Sacramento, wrapped in the uncertain tissue paper of a man who still fears getting gifts wrong. He had meant to present it at the end, but a cousin appeared mid-meal with a bag for them. Tea, preserved plums, a small book of poems with characters Adrian could not read, and a translation that read like it had been composed by a patient angel. The cousin bowed. The moment called for the Aurelius guest to reciprocate with care, not clumsiness. Naomi caught Adrian's eye and gave him a nod that said, "Present yours now." 2 hands, small words, less explanation, more heart. Adrian stood and offered the packages with the posture he'd learned watching a server in his own house learn to pour tea without arrogance. "For you," he said in Mandarin, the sentence a little tremulous, the tones correct enough to convey meaning without tripping. Liang's mother accepted, eyes bright. "Americans cannot drink tea alone forever," she said in English. "Sometimes you must also eat chocolate." After lunch, Naomi and Adrian helped clear dishes because hospitality has no spectators. Liang's mother protested once and then gave up because people who truly mean to help cannot be stopped by polite deflection. They washed bowls in a sink that had seen decades. Soap made bubbles like laughter. Naomi stood on a mat and told a story about the Aurelius dishwasher Ruth, who had taught herself 3 languages. Liang's mother listened, like a person taking notes on a child she had adopted from afar. They walked later through a park that looked like leisure had been planted by old hands. Men played zhangqi with a seriousness that would have intimidated executives. Women walked in pairs, stories and bodies swaying rhythm. A man sang into the afternoon with a voice like a horn from a ship leaving, and his friend accompanied him on a portable speaker turned low, so the song was more invitation than assault. Naomi bought hawthorn skewers dipped in sugar and shared one with Adrian. He bit, winced at the sour, and then grinned at the sweet, and Naomi filed that expression away as evidence that he had learned how delight works. From there, the day tightened into a ceremony. The hall on the 42nd floor had been transformed without becoming a stranger to itself. Lanterns had been hung in a way that looked inevitable. Tables had been set with porcelain that did not compete with the city's light. A calligrapher worked quietly in one corner, making characters appear from ink the way a magician makes birds. At the edge of the room, a small altar had been placed discreetly for those who nod to ancestors before wine. It did not take up space. It made room. Naomi changed her scarf and felt the weight of her choices settle like a garment that fit. Adrian checked his notes and then put them away. The program was straightforward and dense. Thanks to partners, a dedication, a few statements that would move money without reducing it to numbers, a performance by a children's choir who had learned songs that smelled like chestnuts and winter. Before the guests entered, Liang pulled Naomi aside. He spoke in Mandarin first, and her face softened the way people's faces do when they are given chores they like. He repeated the gist for Adrian. "I would like you to translate my remarks," he said. "Not just word to word, meaning. If I brag by accident, hold me back." He smiled, then grew serious. "I have been thinking about your house. I want to be careful not to turn it into a symbol that I own." Naomi nodded. "Symbols break," she said softly. "Houses can be repaired." People arrived in tides, elegant and earnest. The choir took their places like flowers walking. The city outside seeded the room with light. Ling spoke first, and Naomi rendered his Mandarin into English with a cadence that made people look at the person speaking rather than at her. She did not intrude. She did not disappear. She altered one sentence with permission when he said big generosity, and she changed it to steady generosity because the latter makes more sense when you are asking people to give and then give again. At one point, Liang invited Adrian to speak. 5 minutes, no heroics. Adrian had expected this because he was old enough in his career to know that the person who pays for a microphone often hands it to you at some point in the night. He had asked Naomi to prepare him a sentence that would protect him from his own love of polish. He walked to the lectern and set both hands on it the way you steady a bowl you care about. He spoke in English and then risked a small Mandarin greeting to the elders present. He said the one sentence he had written on a card and tucked in his pocket. "We are trying to be a house, not a showroom." Naomi carried it faithfully into Mandarin, and he watched faces ease, an audience forgiving him not for mispronouncing, but for promising something that sounded harder than marble. He finished with thanks and stepped back before his voice could grow the extra feathers it grows when applause arrives. Then the small fiasco that every event needs in order to reveal character. A misprinted program placed Naomi's name as Naomi Carter, Cultural Leisure, a typo that read like a joke and a slight at once. A few guests laughed, not unkindly. Adrian felt heat climb his neck. Naomi smiled, bowed slightly, and tapped the paper once with a fingertip. "I do believe in cultural leisure," she said in Mandarin into the mic, "but only after we do the cultural labor." Laughter rippled exactly right, and the typo became a grace note rather than a scar. Adrian leaned toward Wei and whispered, "Fix the digital version?" And Wei winked. "Already done." There was a moment after speeches when Ritual held the room gently by the shoulders. The calligrapher raised a sheet of rice paper, and Liang's mother stepped onto the small stage with her cane. The calligrapher wrote 4 characters with strokes that felt like weather. Naomi drew in her breath and translated softly, "Jia Ke Rong Ren, a house that makes room for people." Liang bowed to his mother, then to the characters. He took the brush and with a child's diligence, added a smaller line beneath, "Shui Jiao Zuo Ren, learning to be a person." There was applause that felt like prayer, and Naomi discreetly wiped one eye while pretending to adjust her scarf. Formalities ended, and the room turned back into a human place. The choir sang a song about bridges that a poet had written with children in mind and money in the subtext. Plates arrived that tasted like neighborhoods rather than restaurants. People lingered rather than networking. Adrian found himself in an earnest conversation with a young operations manager from a different city who confessed that his hotel's training program had taught him how to fold towels and absolutely nothing about how to bend around grandmother's grief. Adrian told him about the Aurelius card with the sentence, "When you speak, do not try to sound impressive, try to sound careful." The young man wrote it down and said it out loud like a line you practice before you tell the truth to your own boss. Near midnight, when the city had finished shining and started purring, Naomi stepped onto the balcony with a paper cup of tea and looked at the river below, shaped like a thought that had refused to forget itself. Adrian joined her, jacket over his arm, hair a little less obedient than usual. "What will you bring home?" he asked. "The thing your grandmother always tried to teach you, and you were too busy to hear," she said, grinning at his look. Then she answered for real. "A better tea habit, the way that calligrapher held his wrist, the mother's story about two stomachs, the sentence on that paper, house that makes room for people, and this." She tipped her head toward the hall. The feeling of being a guest who is allowed to be proud and still corrected. Adrian nodded. "I will bring back," he said carefully, "the idea that the room is smarter than I am, that I should not try to dominate it, that my job is to notice where the ancestors would be comfortable sitting." They were quiet a little while, listening to a city that had very little silence but plenty of music. Naomi finished her tea. "You did well," she said finally. "Your tone on the greeting would make my old teacher wince, but your face matched your words." 10 degrees, he said. "Across oceans," she said. The next morning they made the rounds that real partnership requires. Contracts were reviewed in rooms with bad art and good light. Kitchen walkthroughs became tiny seminars on onion sizes and the superiority of certain vinegars. Naomi traded notes with a floor manager on the best way to seat elders who pretend they don't mind the draft. Adrian spent 10 minutes with a maintenance tech whose genius involved a rubber gasket, the patience of a parent helping a child with shoelaces, and a story about how pressure behaves when it thinks you're not looking. Before they left, Liang offered a gift that made Adrian stand still. He handed over a folded apron from his mother's kitchen, clean, the fabric heavy with use. "For your kitchen," he said, "so it remembers it belongs to someone's house, not a TV show." He turned to Naomi and placed in her hands a small brush and an ink stick. "For letters you will write to us," he said, "and for the ones you will write inside your hotel without ink." They flew back on a day that looked, from the window, like an endless sheet of blank paper. Adrian slept the sleep of a man who has had his fears gently outnumbered by real things. Naomi read poems from the little book, and then wrote notes for trainings in a hand that had become steadier as her life had become larger. At the Aurelius, the river had kept up its monologue. The staff met them with a cheer that wasn't loud so much as proud. Alvarez held up a ladle like a scepter. Janine reported 3 crises averted and 1 ridiculous customer demand managed without resorting to sarcasm. Angela showed Naomi a housekeeping grid that now functioned like a bridge rather than a trap. That afternoon, Adrian gathered the department heads for a debrief that didn't use the word debrief because life is not the military. He told them about the stage and the 10-degree turn that mattered in Shanghai as it did in Sacramento. He told them about the calligraphy in the phrase, "house that makes room for people," and watched as the room breathed in a way that meant the words had found places to live. Naomi unpacked the brush and the ink stick and set them on a shelf where staff could see them, not as a display but as a reminder. She wrote a new card for Adrian's drawer. It said in her careful hand 2 sentences. "If you bring home only praise, you brought nothing. Bring home work." He taped it beside the others. The drawer felt like a small church of sentences, the kind that bless not with incense but with tasks. Before the day was done, Naomi walked the ballroom, empty between events. She paced 10 degrees this way and that, found the east, turned a chair, and laughed at herself because ritual becomes superstition if you stop listening. She paused at the red string box as if it were a pet that liked to be greeted, and then headed to the kitchen to set the apron down, where it could absorb steam and gossip and oil. Adrian climbed to the mezzanine and looked at the chandelier, the river, and the lives moving under both. He placed his palm on the brass rail she had polished 1,000 times, and, for the first time in months, he did not think of appearances at all. He thought of the small apartment with the lilac paint, and the mother whose hands had told him, without accusation, what houses are for. He thought of a calligrapher's wrist and a choir of children singing bridges. He thought of the gentle correction that turns men into hosts. He sent Naomi 1 text, 10 degrees across oceans, and she sent back a photo of the kitchen apron hanging like a flag in a friendly country. Then he turned to his email and began the dull work of turning everything he had learned into schedules and budgets and training hours. Because if love does not become logistics, it remains a speech. And that night, when the Aurelius fell into the soft version of itself and the river kept writing, Adrian practiced the greeting again in Mandarin, this time in the dark. His tones were better. His face matched them. The house breathed, and somewhere a sentence began to write itself in ink he could not see and still completely trusted. The morning after Shanghai tasted like jet lag and possibility. Adrian woke before his alarm in a city that hadn't noticed he was gone and didn't care that he had returned. He brewed coffee, the ordinary way that men who have recently learned humility brew it, and opened his notebook to the page Naomi had titled, not with flourish, but with intent. Cultural literacy in service of hospitality. It wasn't a brochure, it was a scaffolding. Columns of dates, names, verbs, no slogans. A house plan that assumed people, not marble, would carry the load. He reached the hotel before the pastry team had finished giving the croissants their accidental shallows. The lobby at that hour wore a private face, lamps warm as milk, river light diluted to a thoughtful gray, a bell woman humming something that belonged to her childhood. Adrian stood at the mezzanine rail a moment and let the quiet tell him truths louder than applause. Then he walked downstairs and into a day built from many small promises. Naomi was already there. She was not early in the show-off way. She was early in the methodical way that lets a room exhale by the time everyone else arrives. On a rolling whiteboard, she had copied the week's sessions by hand. Housekeepers notice everything. If you print, they know you clicked. If you write, they know you came earlier than you had to. 4 words that change rooms, 9:30. Ballroom a tea, temperatures in showing up with 2 hands, 11 hours, kitchen pass. Face elders and the 10-degree turn. 14 hour, ballroom B kitchens as language schools. 16 hour, garde manger. Underneath, in smaller letters, she'd added an invitation that looked like a dare. Bring one story your grandmother told you about dignity. The first session drew a crowd wider than the last time she tried. Security showed up not to monitor, but to learn. Engineering stood arms crossed in a way that meant open. Alvarez parked his authority in the back and listened like a student. Front desk agents came with pens and a hunger to do their job without feeling like it was eating them alive. Naomi opened with ni hao and thank you, then surprised them by making the room say sorry in 3 languages, and in English with the structure Phelps had accidentally given them. I'm sorry, I understand why it hurt. Here is what I will do differently. She didn't let anyone tuck if into their apology. She laughed when they tried, gentle as weather, then corrected without fanfare. Try again. We are not auditioning for a part. We are becoming a house. They practiced take your time until the phrase stopped sounding like customer service wallpaper and began to land in voices like a chair slid under someone who didn't know they were allowed to sit. Naomi invited a dishwasher named Ruth to demonstrate accents as biographies rather than obstacles. When I say waiter for water, Ruth said, you can hear my mother. If you correct me by mocking, you are correcting my mother, and she is not here to defend herself. The room laughed, a laugh with edges that broke into murmurs of recognition. Naomi said, we don't make fun of trying, and wrote it on the board. People nodded not theatrically, but like a neck loosening after years at a bad desk. At 11, they moved to the kitchen pass. Tea took over the air, first a bossy boil that bruised leaves, then a patient not quite bubble the color of a promise. Naomi let a new pantry cook burn 1 batch on purpose. Memories last longer when you're a little embarrassed, she said. Alvarez lifted a brow that meant I wouldn't have dared, and then admitted out loud that he believed she was right. A valet raised his hand, shy through the bravado of his uniform. What if I pour wrong? He asked. Then you pour again, Naomi said, but slower, with 2 hands. People forgive mistakes faster than disrespect. Afternoon brought elders and face. Naomi turned tables in 10-degree increments, while Adrian watched the room physically change. A banquet captain admitted she always thought the 10 degrees were superstition. Today I saw my aunt in that angle, she said, and realized I was wrong. Naomi nodded. Superstition is ritual without listening. If you listen, the turn tells you where to stop. By 4, everyone was tired in the way people get tired when they have learned something and realize there is more to learn. Kitchens as language schools began with a pot of kanji and a stack of Post-its. Naomi sent people to different stations to ask 3 questions. What is the name of this in the language that raised you? What story does it belong to? What happens if we hurry? The garde manger whispered, lettuce that sulks when dressed too early. The grill said, steak that becomes a grudge. The pastry station held up a bowl of whipped cream like a cloud and confessed, sweetness that goes violent if you whip past soft peaks. Laughter broke like a dam. They were talking about food and not food. Adrian scribbled because he wanted to remember the exact sound of the room waking up to itself. The program blossomed into habits. A front desk agent taped 4 phrases under his screen in Mandarin characters that meant hello, welcome, one moment please, take your time. He practiced with the concierge who spoke Sunday calligraphy, and they corrected each other and laughed without cruelty. Housekeeping began leaving small notes in rooms, 2 words only in the languages their team carried. Thank you in Tagalog, in Spanish, in Vietnamese, in Arabic, in a looping Khmer script that looked like a river. Guests cried sometimes at the sight, a little, then left tips larger than math promised, and wrote reviews that named staff by name. Names began to circulate like currency, no longer hoarded by management. Adrian fought for budget like a farmer fights rocks, patiently, repeatedly. He moved money from seasonal decor to training hours and dared anyone to fire him for it. Finance grumbled affectionately and then produced a graph that showed spend per guest rising in a soft curve that looked like a story bending toward sense. HR updated the org chart to include cultural liaison as a path, not a one-off miracle. Janine added cross-training patches to schedules like careful stitches that allowed a life to flex. Copycats appeared beyond the river, hotels with newer stone, and a social media manager who could make tulips look like cathedral glass. They announced heritage nights that tasted like performance and posted staff with cue cards teaching hello in 5 languages while tipping went nowhere, and staff quietly mocked a training that had been inflicted rather than invited. Guests noticed the difference the way dogs notice weather. They would say in reviews and in conversations that never reached the internet, we felt something at the Aurelius that we didn't feel there. They could not always name sincerity, but they could name how their shoulders felt when they left. Naomi built a binder that refused to be boring. It wasn't a Bible. It was a field manual, annotated with names and grease, and a sauce print here and there, because kitchens do not respect paper. Sections held the wisdom of people the city barely noticed. Ruth's advice for listening, a valet's trick for recognizing when a parent needed the lobby to become a quiet playground for 20 minutes, Angela's grid for housekeeping schedules that avoided crushing the same 2 people every Friday, Alvarez's page on soup at 2 a.m., including the line in this house, night workers eat like family. Adrian read the binder at night like scripture and found for the first time in years that a manual could make him sentimental. The long game also meant hiring. Naomi drafted interview questions that would tell them more in 10 minutes than resumes in a week. Tell me about a time you were corrected and felt grateful, one read. Teach me to say hello in a language that taught you to be polite, read another. What do you do when someone older than you wastes your time and you need them to move? They hired a server who told the story of a grocery line where a grandmother paid in coins and an impatient man exhaled loudly behind her. The server had intercepted the sigh and turned it into a task by asking the man, cheerfully, to hold her place while she grabbed a forgotten onion. He did, flustered, and left having been forced into a small goodness. Naomi hired her on the spot. Community seeped in. The Aurelius began to host Tuesday mornings where aunties taught staff how to make dumplings, tamales, lumpia, spring rolls. Not as menu development, as memory repair. Staff paid with stories and attention. Photos were taken grudgingly because cheap sentiment stalks real moments. But a few images survived the call. Ruth laughing with flour on her cheek, Alvarez concentrating on the way an elder pleats dough as if it were jewelry. Adrian in an apron finally, not for show, but because he was actually helping, a fact the dishwasher verified with a snort and a thumbs up. There were bumps. A VIP complained that the lobby had turned into a museum of earnestness. Adrian invited him to coffee and asked him to define earnestness. The VIP talked about how he missed when hotels felt anonymous. Adrian said, "We no longer do anonymous, we do respect." The man frowned, then returned 2 months later with his mother and cried in the elevator because a housekeeper had said, "Take your time," when she had to sit after 3 steps. The city noticed without making a fuss. A small write-up appeared in the paper's local section about human-scale excellence. A podcaster with a gentle voice interviewed Naomi about quiet revolutions, and she said only what could survive being replayed at midnight 2 weeks later by someone tired. "We folded 1,000 small corners differently," she said. "That is all." Malik, Naomi's son, watched his mother work the long game and learned something no pep talk could teach. He visited a college where the counselors used the word grit like a brand, and he rolled his eyes in a way that meant he was catching on. He told Naomi at dinner one night that he wanted to study systems because he had seen how a shuttle route adjusted at 11:40 p.m. could change a person's morning. Naomi listened like a woman who had set down a bag and discovered a smaller, softer one inside. Adrian, too, quieted in ways that did not make him smaller. He stopped prefacing ideas with the phrase, "as GM," because position had ceased to be how he won rooms. He measured his days less by crises averted and more by habits installed. When he caught himself writing deliverables in an email to Alvarez, he deleted it and wrote, "Work we will do and finish." He bought a box of red string for the pastry station and labeled it with a word he had once abused in proposals, legacy, and meant it. By summer's end, the Aurelius had acquired a rhythm that would have looked boring to anyone who confused drama with importance. Bell's staff knew when to hush and when to perform. Housekeepers wrote little notes that included weather forecasts as if they were aunties. The kitchen sent bowls of rice to late arrivals without them asking, like a mother line moving through steel and heat. Sincerity stopped being a word in an email. It became muscle memory. One evening, as sunlight decided whether to stick around, Naomi found Adrian in ballroom B with tape on the floor marking the pace of a ceremony scheduled 3 weeks hence. He was walking the path a bride's grandmother would take, counting steps to the nearest chair. He looked up, caught, and shrugged. "I am practicing boredom," he said. Naomi laughed. "Boredom?" "The long game," he said. "It's making tiny good choices so many times they stop being choices." "Boredom is a luxury," she said. "It means we aren't firefighting." "Then call it peace," he said. She set down the binder, now fatter, and leaned against a column that had seen weddings and storms and investors and nights when nothing happened. "Peace is work," she said. "People think it's the absence of trouble. It's actually the presence of 1,000 disciplines." They stood together in the room that had almost undone them a year before. The chandelier above them pretended not to listen, the way expensive things do when they've been taught their place. Adrian touched the tape marks with his toe, nudging one a fraction for some elder he'd never meet. Naomi watched and felt that rare adult joy. Same house, same job title on paper, entirely different life. At closing, the staff room held a small celebration without an occasion. Ruth's birthday, kind of. A pastry cook's citizenship, sort of. A dishwasher's payday that didn't feel like a stay of execution, but like oxygen. Someone had taped a card to the fridge with a sentence Naomi recognized as her own. "If you only bring home praise, you brought nothing. Bring home work." Alvarez slapped a ladle on a table like a gavel and asked for toast. Adrian kept it short. "To the long game," he said. "To not getting bored?" Naomi raised her paper cup and added, "To the 10-degree turn you cannot see until you have turned." They drank soda and soup as if they were champagne, which in a way they were. Outside, the river wrote without tiring. Inside, the house breathed, then kept breathing, like a chest that had finally learned the difference between holding itself upright and being held upright by fear. The thing about a long game is that it gives you time to fail properly. Not theatrically, not in the way that trends love to transmit, but in the way that humans need if they are to keep becoming tolerable to one another. The fall came on a Friday, because of course it did. A video no longer than a breath, filmed at an angle that flattened nuance into outrage, posted with a caption designed to ignite the dry kindling that lives in every comment section. A junior manager, Evan, stood at the pass, jaw tight, voice 2 notches too loud, telling a line cook to use your brain and stop acting new because a sauce had split at the wrong moment and a plate had gone out, looking like the kind of mistake diners notice even when their date is telling them that mothers have stopped speaking to them. The cook, Ayo, young, precise, from a family who had told her that knives can be used to feed or to cut, held her hands very still while her face did the complicated math of humiliation. Someone, too quick, too late, stepped between them. The moment had already recorded itself. By Sunday, the clip had been viewed 600,000 times and shared by accounts that profited from moral clarity at scale. People who had never wiped a plate with their own sleeve declared expertise on leadership. People who had actually worked kitchens winced. A few called for Evan to be fired. A few, uglier, circled Ayo's accent as if it were proof of anything at all. The Aurelius was tagged like a wall in a bad neighborhood. Adrian's first instinct was the old one: manage optics. He wrote and deleted 3 statements in the tone of a man who has once believed he could outsmooth reality. Naomi found him at his desk with his face in his hands and took the keyboard like a nurse takes a thermometer. "We will not make statements before we speak to the people hurt," she said. "We are a house. We act like one." They began where houses begin, in the kitchen. The team had run service like professionals under siege, which is to say they had fed people without weaponizing their own shame. Alvarez had thrown himself into the work, not to atone for Evan. Evan's decisions were his own, but to let the kitchen remember the trust in its muscle memory. He sat now on the milk crate that had become a confessional booth and listened while Ayo spoke. She did not weep. She said 3 things with the steadiness of a woman who knows that clarity is a form of rescue. "He was cruel," she said. "The plate was wrong and I would have fixed it. The way he spoke made me feel like I should be smaller to fit the room." Naomi asked if Ayo wanted to attend the forum that was already forming in Naomi's mind like weather. Ayo nodded, not because she craved spectacle, but because language shared becomes a ladder. Evan hovered near the dish pit, eyes red, dignity doing his worst work. "I messed up," he said, which is nothing like "I am sorry." Naomi put a hand up like a crossing guard. "Hold your apology," she said. "It will mean more later if you stop trying to purchase forgiveness quickly." The forum that Monday was not a stunt. It did not live stream. It made no press release. HR attended with the humility of people who usually perform power and had been instructed to perform listening. The union steward was there with a notebook and eyebrows that could flay the careless. Adrian sat in a chair with the insignificance of a man who had learned that a room can thrive without him at the center. Naomi facilitated with a drawl she saved for rooms where the adrenaline needed somewhere to go besides throats. She wrote 3 questions on a board. What happened? Who was hurt? How do we make repair? Ayo spoke first because leaving the wounded to last is cruelty with paperwork. She told the story without embroidery. She mentioned the sauce, the shout, the cadence of the words "use your brain," which had landed like a centuries-old insult with a new suit on. She said she almost quit and then did not because Ruth had handed her a bowl of staff soup and said, "Stay until you can leave on your own terms, not because you were pushed." Ruth stared at the table and wiped her eyes like this was nothing. Evan spoke next. He said the sentence the room was waiting for, and to his credit, he said it in the right order. "I am sorry," he said. "I understand why it hurt. Here is what I will do differently." He did not add the weasel words of childhood, but, because Naomi had physically taped a note next to the whiteboard. No ifs and apologies. He said he would accept a demotion and the pay cut that came with it. He said he would sit in Naomi's trainings as a student, not a special case. He said he would not resist a transfer to a station where Ayo would not have to see him until she wanted to. He did not cry in public because that would have looked like a bid for absolution. He cried in the hallway later and was given a towel, not a camera. The room spoke. A banquet server said the video had made her stomach go cold because she had heard that tone at other jobs and left those houses and hoped she had left that tone behind forever. A concierge confessed that she had used a softer version of that voice the week before on a trainee and only realized now that she had been rehearsing a cruelty in miniature. Security asked what posture they should take when voices rise that are not protecting life, but performing dominance. Engineering offered to adjust the sound footprint near the pass so everything didn't feel like stage. Alvarez stood and said he had failed to interrupt early enough. The room told him not to make it about him. He sat, chastened, loved. Naomi closed the circle, not with pronouncement, but with homework. The house would put the apology structure on every wall where the public did not see it. The demotion would happen in writing, not a whispered rumor. Evan would be mentored by Ruth, who wanted nothing to do with management, but knew exactly how to be humane under heat. She accepted the assignment with a shrug that looked like a heroine refusing a cape. Ayo would be offered a station change with a raise because the fastest way to insult talent is to let it associate itself permanently with a moment somebody else broke. She said yes and asked if she could teach a session on how to recover a sauce in a conversation, and Alvarez laughed so loudly the room broke tension like a plate. The public wanted its statement and eventually got one. It was unsatisfying to people who crave blood and exactly right for people who live in rooms. It named harm without adjectives. It promised repair with verbs: demoted, mentored, trained, changed. It ended with a sentence that tested as too earnest with marketing and survived because Naomi's eyebrow had learned to be mightier than a logo. "We are a house," it read. "When someone breaks a plate, we do not burn the kitchen. We clean, we repair, we teach, and we keep cooking." The internet did what it does: yelled, got bored, moved on. Inside, the hotel did what it now knew how to do: remember. Ayo's class was scheduled on a Wednesday and filled beyond capacity. She recreated the split sauce in the conversation. "First," she said, holding the pot, "you turn down the heat. Shouting at fat doesn't make it emulsify." The room laughed, then took notes. "Second, you whisk in patience and a little water. The goal is not to punish the oil for escaping. It is to welcome it back." Naomi stood in the back and felt the satisfying click of a house owning its failure in a way that made it more itself. Evan showed up to trainings on time and sat where it was uncomfortable, not from a punitive assignment, but from proximity to humility. He learned the apology sentence by heart. He caught himself twice in a month and corrected tone out loud with a muttered "again" that made people grin. Ruth taught him how to say "please carry" in Yoruba, and then made him practice until the vowels stopped sounding like he was stepping on them. He peeled 100 pounds of carrots and rediscovered why kitchens had once saved his life. Naomi installed a new ritual at pre-shift: 10 seconds of breath. Not mindfulness, not theatrical. Just 10 seconds in which managers closed their mouths and staff checked whether their chests were about to launch them into a fight they didn't need. Alvarez put a hand on his heart the first week and then did it without thinking. The hotel began arriving to service like a choir that had tuned, not like a swarm of radios all set to different stations. The long catch wasn't just internal. A guest recognized Ayo at the pass and said, "Are you the one from the video?" The room froze. Ayo said yes and stared back just long enough to restore a small power imbalance. The guest nodded. "Your sauce is better than my television," he said. She laughed, thanked him, and sent out a plate that made the table order a second. Adrian learned something about himself he wished he didn't need to learn at 50, that he still wanted to win rooms with Polish and could not if he meant to keep the house honest. He stopped practicing statements. He started practicing structures that did not require him to perform wisdom. He let Naomi lead in rooms where years ago he would have dominated. He slept better, partly from exhaustion, partly from the novel relief of not lying. A month later, when everyone had forgotten except the people who remember on purpose, Naomi scheduled a staff forum on dignity that had no precipitating scandal. People showed anyway. She wrote a new question on the board: "How do we make it easy to tell the truth here?" A bellwoman said, "By not making it expensive." A housekeeper said, "By using our names when praise travels up." A cook said, "By not pretending that bilingual means perfect." Adrian wrote each sentence on paper that would become part of the binder, and if tear stains warped one page, nobody mentioned it. On the anniversary of Liang's first visit, Ayo and Evan worked the same service without incident. He asked for a garnish with a tone that felt like a human speaking to a human. She handed it over with a small nod, then glanced at the clock with a smirk. "You aren't slow," she said. "You're deliberate." He laughed and let the compliment do its work. Naomi walked through the dining room later and watched two generations of apology pass each other like ships that had learned how not to collide. She returned to the staff room and found Adrian with the drawer of index cards open again. When you speak, be careful. When you are judged, be true. Bring home work. She added one more in her own neat hand. When we fall, we do not perform being broken. We practice the catch. A year remakes a house the way a tide remakes a shoreline, grain by grain, until even the stubborn rocks look different because the light has learned new angles. On a mild morning, the Aurelius woke into its own anniversary, which is to say, it woke into a day that resembled 100 others and was therefore sacred. The lobby laid itself out like a sentence, willing to be read slowly. The river wrote. Staff arrived carrying coffee and lives. Somewhere a vacuum cleaner sang the monotone hymn of maintenance. Liang returned with less choreography than the first time and more ease. He came alone at first, no assistance, a man between meetings who wanted to stand in a lobby and see if the room still remembered his mother's language. He wore a blue sweater and shoes that could have belonged to a professor, not a magnet. Naomi met him near the brass rail out of habit and affection. Adrian stood back and watched two friends check a house like parents checking a child's temperature with the palm, not a thermometer. You look better, Liang said to Adrian in English. I am better, Adrian replied, not because of you, because of us. They walked the house not as inspectors, but as residents who had paid rent in attention. The concierge desk had acquired a low shelf with 4 small cards. Hello, thank you, take your time. How may I help you? In the languages most often heard in the lobby. Staff picked them up like talismans. The ballroom bore a tiny notch on a column where tape had once marked a 10-degree turn. Naomi left it as a reminder that precision, not perfection, had saved them. The kitchen smelled like decisions made in the right order. Staff dining had a bulletin board labeled Promises Kept with 3 laminated photos. The night shift soup line steaming, the shuttle map with extended late routes, a list of childcare reimbursement partners that had finally, painfully, made it through HR's nervous system. At noon, a quiet ceremony marked the renewal. No press. 2 investors, the ones who had learned to breathe differently. Janine because she had held the building while others became famous. Alvarez in a jacket clean enough to confer respect, but not new enough to suggest theater. Ruth dragged in against her protestations because trophies are for the loud, while Ruth preferred to measure her life in bowls of soup correctly salted. Ayo and Evans stood near each other with the easy alertness of colleagues who have decided not to waste energy on old scripts. In a small room with a window that let in the honest light from the staff lot, Liang placed a copy of the contract on the table. It was shorter than before, bolder in its assumption that trust does not require paragraph-length hedges. He signed. Adrian signed. Naomi signed in the margin as a witness, which felt right. Her signature had threaded the year without needing to own it. Liang cleared his throat and for the first time looked uncertain. He spoke in Mandarin, letting Naomi carry the meaning. I want to send you someone, he said, not to be served, to learn. A nephew, Naomi teased, and he laughed. A manager, he said, from a property that looks like it has money and lacks a house. Send 2, Adrian said, impulsive, generous, ready. We will put them on laundry for a week, then front desk, then the kitchen, no shortcuts. They will hate you, Liang said with delight. They will love us later, Naomi said, if they are the right ones. Afternoon unfolded into work because work is how houses celebrate themselves. A delegation arrived early for a site tour and was gently redirected to chairs by a bellwoman who called them by name. A toddler tried to eat a polished pebble and was dissuaded with a pastry because grace can be bribed. A guest lost a wallet and found it because security had learned to stand in ways that made thieves feel seen. Small mercies multiplied. Midday, Adrian called an all-hands that did not demand attendance and was therefore full. He didn't stand on a stage. He stood at the same level, with the chandelier pretending not to eavesdrop. He spoke briefly, because brevity was how he paid respect to people who lifted plates for a living. This year, he said, we made a long list of small promises and kept enough of them. He gestured to Naomi. She spoke in plain sentences. We are not finished, and she said, we will never be finished. If we are finished, we are dead. She introduced the next quarter's sessions with the casual audacity of a person who has ceased apologizing for excellence. Listening to accents without making people work. Apology is practice, not performance. The 10-degree turn-in rooms you cannot physically rotate. Soups of refuge. How to seat elders who claim they don't care where they sit. People smiled at the titles and wrote down the times. Ruth slouched and then raised a hand to ask whether she had to teach again. Yes, Naomi said, but you can sit while doing it. After, in the staff room that had become a chapel for practical theology, Naomi put the inkstone from Shanghai on a table and ground ink with water while people drifted in and out. The smell of it, mineral and old, mingled with coffee and soup. She wrote 4 characters, careful, steady, then a line under them that had become their private signature. Jia Ke Rong Ren, a house that makes room for people. Jue de Zuo Ren, learning to be a person. She taped it to the fridge because reverence is often a refrigerator away from absurdity. A call came from the front desk. A guest in the lobby had asked for a manager, the urgent kind of ask that in other houses means trouble. Adrian answered because old habits don't always mean bad outcomes. In the lobby stood a woman in her 60s with hair like weather and a coat that had known both boardrooms and buses. She held out a hand. "I'm Ao's mother," she said. Adrian felt his face change into its truest shape. "I wanted to see where she works," the woman said, "because she speaks of it like a church she believes in." He gave her the kind of tour churches fail to do because they love their altars more than their kitchens. He showed her the pass, the staff soup line, the clean bathrooms where dignity didn't have to hold its breath. The woman nodded at each, then surprised him. "Show me where she cried," she said. He took her to a hallway with bad art and good light. She stood there and did nothing for a minute, then said, "It is safe here now." He said, "We try," and meant it. Evening leaned in. The lobby's light warmed. Naomi found Malik by the mezzanine, tall now in a way that makes a mother swear softly at fate. He showed her an email, an early admission to a program that didn't promise to make him rich, but promised to teach him how buses and lights and water and human beings find each other without breaking. She hugged him in a way that embarrassed him and decided not to care. "You will come back and fix my shuttle routes," she said. "I will send a bill," he said. She laughed, and her laughter threaded through the floor and the walls and the systems that would, one day, hold his debts and his children. Liang, on his way out, paused at the brass rail the way some men pause at altars. He placed his palm flat, feeling for warmth. He looked at Naomi. "Do you ever get tired?" he asked, not as a test. "Every day," she said. "And then I rest here." She tapped the rail. "It remembers me." He nodded. "I will steal your binder," he said. "I mailed you a copy yesterday," she replied, then added, "Annotated. We add recipes for soup when a city is sad." Adrian walked him to the door, not because power demands escorts, but because friendship looks like seeing someone off. "Next time," Adrian said, "come with your mother." "I will," Liang said. "She wants to scold you about chairs again." "I left a chair turned east for her," Adrian said. "You turned it 10 degrees too far," Liang said, and smiled. When the night crew took over, the hotel did not sigh like a beast relieved of a rider. It simply continued. Housekeeping folded sheets with an authority born of repetition and pride. Security tuned radios. The kitchen fed the staff, and then sent home boxes to those with long buses. The shuttle driver took the extra loop and didn't announce it as charity. Ruth practiced a word in a language nobody suspected she was learning. Ao wrote a shopping list on her phone. Tamarind, chilies, limes. Evan took out trash and felt useful. Adrian returned to his office and opened the drawer. The index cards had multiplied. He read them like a ritual. "When you speak, be careful. When you are judged, be true. Bring home work. When we fall, practice the catch." He added one more in his own blocky hand. "Who are you not seeing?" He taped it square and stood up. He found Naomi in the service corridor with a cart that behaved because she had learned its temperament. A wheel with a limp will go straight if you load it with respect. She was writing the next week's schedule on the whiteboard. Her handwriting had become bolder without becoming arrogant. He stood beside her, and the air held them without ceremony. "Who are we not seeing?" he asked, a question that had reorganized his life. Naomi capped the marker, considered, and smiled the smallest smile. The person who will turn this rail, she said, tapping the brass. After we retire, we should leave them a note. What should it say? He asked. Nothing fancy, she said. Keep the soup hot. Turn the chairs 10 degrees when the room asks. Speak like you mean to stay. And when you miss, because you will, say sorry the right way and keep going. Write it, he said. She wrote it. They taped it to the inside of a cabinet where staff keeps supplies and secrets. The janitorial closet became, by accident, the hotel's scripture. The house quieted further as the hour grew kind. Outside, the river continued composing its same sentence with tiny variations. Inside, a building that had once mistaken shine for virtue lay down and rested like a creature at peace. And somewhere, perhaps in Shanghai, perhaps in Bakersfield, perhaps in the space between a grandmother's kitchen and a boardroom where somebody finally loosened their tie, someone asked the question that keeps good houses good. Who are you overlooking right now in the room you believe you own? The Aurelius, having practiced its answer for a year, breathed in, breathed out, and replied without speaking. Not anymore.